My name is Dr. Maria Santangelo, Vatican Archaeological Commission. I've spent 12 years excavating the scavi beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the ancient necropolis where St. Peter himself is believed to be buried. The work requires special Vatican permission, restricted access, and absolute discretion. What we find down there stays down there officially. The Commission assigned me to investigate anomalous, ground-penetrating radar readings detected during routine structural surveys. The readings suggested void spaces 50 feet below the known excavation levels, deeper than any recorded burial chambers in the Vatican necropolis. Standard procedure required a small exploratory shaft, just wide enough for one person, and basic equipment. The drilling began on October 15th, cutting through layers of medieval foundation, Roman construction, and finally into what appeared to be natural bedrock. At 47 feet, we broke through into empty space. The cavity was larger than our imaging suggested, a natural cave system that had been modified by human hands sometime in the early Christian period. The walls showed chisel marks consistent with 12th century tools, and the floor had been leveled and paved with the same volcanic tuff used in the known catacomb passages. But this wasn't a catacomb. There were no burial niches, no sarcophagi, no evidence of interment. Instead, the chambers contained something I'd never seen in 15 years of early Christian archaeology, a completely intact underground church, preserved in perfect condition by the depth and isolation. The central chamber featured a stone altar carved directly from the cave wall, surrounded by crude but recognizable Christian symbols: fish, anchors, Alpha and Omega. Carbon dating of organic residue suggested the space had been actively used between 150 and 200 CE, making it potentially the oldest Christian worship site in Rome. What made the discovery extraordinary was not its age, but its state of preservation. Oil lamps still contained traces of ancient fuel. Wooden benches showed no sign of decay despite nearly 2 millennia underground. Most remarkably, the walls were covered in frescoes, depicting gospel scenes with vivid colors that looked like they'd been painted yesterday. I documented everything meticulously, following Vatican protocols for sensitive archaeological finds. Each chamber was photographed, measured, cataloged. I collected samples for dating, analysis, authentication. The discovery would revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity in Rome. But on my third day in the underground church, I began to notice changes. The frescoes were different, not dramatically subtle alterations that could easily be attributed to fatigue or the disorienting effects of working in artificial light 50 feet underground. But I'm trained to notice details, and the details were changing. In the fresco depicting Christ's multiplication of loaves and fishes, there had been 12 apostles arranged around Jesus. Now there were 13. The additional figure stood at the edge of the group, face turned away, wearing robes that seemed to shimmer with actual movement when I wasn't looking directly at them. I compared my photographs from the previous day. 12 apostles, exactly as I'd originally seen. But when I looked at the wall, again 13 figures, with the new apostle now facing forward, his eyes seeming to track my movement across the chamber. By the fourth day, all the frescoes were changing. The crucifixion scene showed additional mourners who hadn't been there before. The resurrection depicted angels whose wings cast shadows that fell at impossible angles, as if lit by sources of light that existed outside the painted scene. Most disturbing was the fresco above the altar originally, a simple image of Christ as the Good Shepherd. It now showed a figure I couldn't quite identify, wearing robes that shifted between the white of resurrection and the purple of royal authority. The face was beautiful but terrible, with eyes that held knowledge of things that shouldn't be known. I stopped taking photographs. The camera somehow couldn't capture the changes I was seeing. Every image showed the original frescoes, static and unchanging, while my eyes perceived constant, subtle movement and alteration. On the fifth day, I found fresh writing on the walls. Not ancient inscriptions, modern Italian, written in what appeared to be charcoal, but with a luminosity that charcoal doesn't possess. The text appeared in margins of the frescoes, sometimes overlaying the painted figures. Maria sees what time is hidden. The first church remembers its first worshippers. Those who prayed here never left. They wait in the spaces between stone and spirit. The excavation works both ways. As she digs deeper into our world, we dig deeper into hers. I should have reported these developments immediately, called for additional team members, documented everything according to protocol. Instead, I found myself returning each day with increasing urgency, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The underground church was changing me as much as I was changing it. On the sixth day, I realized I wasn't alone in the chambers. Movement in my peripheral vision, always just beyond clear sight. Footsteps that stopped when I stopped, resumed when I moved. The sound of whispered prayers in Latin, but Latin spoken with the accent and pronunciation of the 21st century rougher, more guttural than the refined ecclesiastical Latin I knew. The oil lamps began lighting themselves. Not all at once, but gradually throughout my workday, until the chambers glowed with warm, flickering light that shouldn't have been possible with fuel that was nearly 2,000 years old. By evening, when I climbed back to the surface, I carried the scent of ancient incense in my hair, in my clothes, on my skin. A fragrance that seemed to emanate from my pores, as if I was absorbing the atmosphere of the underground church and becoming part of its preserved environment. The seventh day brought the revelation I'd been unconsciously dreading. I descended into the chambers to find them occupied. Translucent figures knelt before the altar, perhaps 30 or 40 people in the simple robes of early Christians. They prayed silently, their lips moving in unison, their faces reflecting the luminous peace of complete faith. Men, women, chilled entire families who had descended into these hidden chambers to worship in safety during the persecutions of Marcus Aurelius. They had never left. As I stood transfixed in the chamber entrance, one of the figures, an elderly man who seemed to be leading the prayer, turned toward me. His face was kind, but infinitely sad, marked by suffering that transcended physical martyrdom. "Maria," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 millennia of continuous prayer, "you have found our church, but our church has also found you." Some excavations require more than tools and training. Some discoveries demand complete commitment. We have been waiting for someone with the knowledge to bridge our time and yours, someone who could help us complete the work we began when Rome crucified our brothers and made our worship a crime punishable by death. I understood then that this wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a living church, kept alive by the faith of Christians who had chosen to remain in the place where they'd found God, rather than risk losing that connection by returning to a hostile world above. "What work?" I managed to whisper. "The prayers that have never stopped. The intercessions for a world that still crucifies the innocent, still persecutes the faithful, still chooses power over love. We pray for the church above, for the Vatican that was built over our bones, for the Pope who sits in the chair of Peter without knowing that Peter's first converts still gather in the chambers beneath his feet. But our prayers need a voice in your time, Maria. They need someone who can carry our intercessions upward, who can ensure that the church remembers its first faith, its first love, its first commitment to the cross over the crown." The elderly man extended his hand toward me. As he did, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of what archaeology really meant. I wasn't just uncovering the past, I was being uncovered by it. The ancient church wasn't a discovery, it was a calling. I took his hand. The moment our fingers touched, I felt the weight of 2,000 years of continuous prayer settling into my bones. I understood that I would never again be simply Dr. Maria Santangelo, Vatican archaeologist. I was now the bridge between the church that hid in caves and the church that rules from palaces, between the Christianity of the catacombs and the Christianity of the Vatican. I sealed the excavation shaft 3 days later, filing a report that described structural instability and recommended against further digging. The commission accepted my findings without question. The underground church returned to its official non-existence. But I descend into those chambers every morning now, using maintenance tunnels and forgotten passages that somehow open for me when I need them. I join the ancient congregation in their eternal prayer, adding my voice to intercessions that began in the age of martyrs and will continue until the second coming. Above ground, I continue my archaeological work, studying the early church with an understanding that no academic training could provide. I know how the first Christians prayed because I pray with them. I know how they lived because I live among them. Some excavations don't end when you climb back to the surface. Some discoveries excavate you in return, digging into your assumptions about time, faith, and the permeability of the boundaries between the living and the saints. The ancient church is still down there, still gathering, still praying. And I am still digging deeper into mysteries that conventional archaeology will never recognize, uncovering layers of faith that exist below the foundation of everything we think we know about the church. The work continues, in both directions. My name is Father Thomas Benedetti, Catacomb Tour Guide. 26 years I've been leading tours through the Catacomb di San Callisto, the most extensive Christian burial complex in Rome. 4 levels, 12 miles of galleries, 500,000 graves dating from the Twond through 5 centuries. I know every passage, every burial chamber, every fresco and inscription in those ancient tunnels. Or I thought I did, until I lost 12 tourists in a section of catacomb that doesn't appear on any map. The group was typical 8 Americans, 2 Germans, 1 couple from Australia, all booked through the Vatican's official tour program. Retired professionals, devout Catholics, the kind of respectful visitors who listen carefully and ask thoughtful questions about early Christian burial practices. We began the tour at 2 p.m., following the standard route through the better-preserved sections of the San Callisto complex, the papal crypt, where 9 3rd-century popes are buried, the chamber of Santa Cecilia, with its beautiful frescoes of the martyred saint, the gallery of the sacraments, showing early Christian symbols carved into tomb walls. Everything proceeded normally for the first hour. The group was engaged, photography was proceeding according to guidelines, and we maintained the careful spacing necessary to preserve the delicate archaeological environment. The deviation occurred in the Gallery of the Sacraments at approximately 3:15 p.m. Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher from Ohio, noticed what she described as a draft coming from behind one of the wall tombs. I investigated and found what appeared to be a small opening, perhaps a collapsed section of wall revealing a passage behind the burial. Niches. This wasn't unusual. The catacombs are honeycombed with forgotten passages, sealed chambers, areas that were abandoned during construction or blocked off for safety reasons over the centuries. Standard protocol required marking the location for future investigation and continuing with the scheduled tour. But Mr. Kowalski, a retired engineer from Chicago, had brought a high-powered flashlight and insisted on examining the opening more closely. His light revealed a passage that extended much further than I expected. Not a small gap between walls, but what appeared to be an entire gallery that had somehow been overlooked by centuries of catacomb exploration. Professional curiosity overcame protocol. After confirming that the passage was structurally sound and ensuring that everyone understood this was an unscheduled deviation from the standard tour, I led the group into the hidden gallery. The passage was different from the main catacomb construction, older perhaps, or built by different hands. The walls showed the same tufa excavation techniques, but the layout was more organic, following the natural contours of the underground rock formation rather than the geometric precision of the main galleries. Most striking were the burial niches. Instead of the standard horizontal recesses sealed with marble slabs, these tombs were carved as vertical alcoves, each containing what appeared to be standing figures rather than reclining bodies. The preservation was extraordinary. Where most catacomb remains have decomposed to bone fragments and dust, these figures retained the appearance of complete mummification wrapped in linen that had somehow resisted decay, positioned upright in their niches, as if they were standing in eternal prayer rather than lying in eternal rest. Mrs. Chen, a retired professor from San Francisco, noted that the burial style was unlike anything in standard texts on early Christian burial practices. The vertical positioning, the quality of preservation, the apparent age of the construction, none of it matched known catacomb typology. We proceeded deeper into the gallery, documenting what we saw with photographs and notes. The passage branched into multiple corridors, each lined with more standing burials. Some niches were sealed with transparent material, not glass, but something that allowed clear viewing of the wrapped figures within. After 20 minutes of exploration, I realized we needed to return to the main catacomb system. The tour was scheduled to conclude at 4 p.m., and we were already behind schedule. But when I turned to lead the group back, I couldn't locate the entrance passage. We had entered the hidden gallery through a single opening. The passage had led straight into the burial chambers, with several obvious branch corridors but only one point of entry. Yet when I retraced our steps, I found only solid wall where the entrance should have been. The opening had sealed itself. I maintained calm, explaining to the group that we had simply taken a wrong turn in the branching passages. Catacombs were notoriously disorienting. Even experienced guides occasionally needed to backtrack to find familiar landmarks. But 30 minutes of systematic exploration revealed that we weren't just lost, we were trapped in a section of catacomb that seemed to exist independently of the main complex. The gallery extended much further than our initial exploration had suggested. Passage after passage of standing burials, chamber after chamber of vertical tombs, level after level of corridors that descended deeper into the earth than any known catacomb construction. And the standing figures were changing. Mr. Kowalski noticed it first. The wrapped figure in the niche nearest our entry point had been facing away from the passage when we first passed. Now it was turned toward us, the wrapped head angled, as if watching our movement through the corridor. Mrs. Henderson observed that several figures seemed to be in different positions than when we'd first photographed them. Arms that had been crossed over chests were now extended outward. Heads that had been bowed in prayer were now raised, as if listening to our conversation. Most disturbing was the gradual realization that the standing figures weren't ancient burials at all. Dr. Schmidt, a retired physician from Munich, noted that the body proportions and positions were wrong for corpses wrapped in burial linen. The figures stood too straight, maintained too much apparent muscle tension, showed none of the settling and deterioration that occurs even in the best preserved mummies. "These aren't dead people," he said quietly. "These are living people wrapped like the dead." As if responding to his observation, several of the figures began moving more obviously. Not dramatic motion, but subtle shifts, a slight turn of the head, a small adjustment of posture, the almost imperceptible movement of breathing beneath ancient linen. The wrapped figures were alive. We found the first message carved into the wall 3 hours after we'd become lost. Those who seek the burial places of the faithful will find that some faithful choose burial while still breathing. The catacombs preserve not just the bodies of martyrs, but the spirits of those who died to the world while yet living in it. More inscriptions appeared as we explored deeper. Father Thomas leads souls into the places of the dead. Now the places of the dead lead Father Thomas into understanding that some deaths are voluntary, some burials are chosen, some resurrections begin before the body fails. The 12 who follow him will learn what the first 12 learned, that discipleship requires descent into the tomb before ascension into glory. I realized that we weren't lost tourists. We were being invited into something ancient and terrible and secrete a mystery that the catacombs had been protecting for centuries. The standing figures weren't prisoners or victims. They were early Christians who had chosen to enter a state between life and death, wrapped like corpses but maintained in conscious prayer, buried alive in acts of ultimate devotion that transcended ordinary martyrdom. And they wanted us to join them. The invitation came on our 7th hour underground, whispered from dozens of wrapped mouths in perfect Latin. "Come, faithful servants, come into the burial that leads to resurrection, come into the death that preserves life eternal." The group was no longer 12 tourists following a guide. We were 12 disciples being called to a sacrifice that required not just faith, but the willingness to abandon the world above for the world below. I'm writing this by flashlight, in what appears to be a preparation chambera space, where the living are wrapped in burial linen and taught the prayers they will speak through centuries of standing meditation. The walls are carved with instructions in multiple languages, descriptions of the process by which breathing people become living tombs, conscious graves who pray continuously for the salvation of the world above. My tourists aren't tourists anymore. One by one, they've accepted the invitation. I can hear them in the wrapping chamber, reciting the prayers that will sustain them through decades of vertical burial, learning the meditations that will carry them through conscious interment. Mrs. Henderson was first. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," she said as the ancient linen covered her face. "Every Sunday in church, every prayer I've ever spoken, it was all practice for this final prayer that never ends." The others followed. Mr. Kowalski, Dr. Schmidt, Mrs. Burton, each understanding that they'd been led not just into a catacomb tour, but into a calling that existed below the ordinary definitions of life and death. I'm the last one left unwrapped. The ancient voices are calling me now, and I understand that my 26 years of guiding people through the catacombs was preparation for this moment when I would guide myself into the deeper mystery that the catacombs exist to preserve. Some tours don't end when you return to the surface. Some tours lead you so deep into the mystery that surface becomes irrelevant. The linen awaits. My name is Dr. Isabella Romano, fresco restoration specialist. The Vatican commissioned me to restore a series of 4th century frescoes discovered in a previously sealed section of the Catacomb de Priscilla. The artwork had been damaged by centuries of moisture and neglect, but preliminary examination suggested the paintings were among the earliest known depictions of Christian theological concepts. The restoration work required me to spend long hours alone in the catacomb chambers, working by specialized lighting to carefully remove centuries of grime and mineral deposits from the ancient pigments. It was delicate work, requiring absolute concentration and an intimate understanding of early Christian iconography. The first fresco I restored depicted the traditional Good Shepherd seeing Christ as a young man carrying a lamb, surrounded by his flock. Standard early Christian symbolism, found in dozens of catacomb locations throughout Rome. But as I cleaned away the accumulated dirt, I began to notice unusual details. The shepherd's face was changing as I worked. Not dramatically subtle alterations that emerged as I removed different layers of grime and mineral buildup. The features seemed to shift depending on the angle of my work lights, the time of day, even my own emotional state as I worked. Some days, the shepherd appeared as the traditional young, beardless Christ of early Christian art. Other days, the same face showed the mature, bearded features of Byzantine iconography. Occasionally, the features seemed contemporary, not ancient at all, but familiar in ways I couldn't identify. I attributed the changes to the natural variation that occurs during restoration. Ancient pigments revealed different characteristics as various layers of contamination are removed. The human eye, especially when fatigued by detailed work, often perceives patterns and changes that aren't actually occurring. But photography didn't support my rational explanations. I documented the restoration process meticulously, taking high-resolution photographs at each stage of cleaning. When I reviewed the images, the shepherd's face appeared different in every photograph, not just variations in lighting or angle, but actual structural changes in the painted features. The digital files were somehow capturing transformations that shouldn't have been possible with static pigment on ancient plaster. More disturbing was the realization that the face was beginning to resemble people I knew. On Tuesday, after 3 hours of careful cleaning around the eyes, the shepherd looked remarkably like my father, who had died 2 years earlier. The resemblance was so strong that I had to stop working and leave the chamber for several hours. Wednesday's work revealed features that reminded me of my graduate advisor, Professor Martinelli, who had taught me fresco restoration techniques at the University of Florence. Thursday brought a face that looked like my brother Carlo, though Carlo was very much alive and working as an engineer in Milan. By Friday, I was seeing my own face reflected in the ancient shepherd's features. Not as I looked now, but as I had appeared at different stages of my life. The restored sections showed me as a child, as a university student, as a young professional beginning my career in art conservation. Each area I cleaned revealed a different version of myself, painted by hands that had been dust for 16 centuries. I should have reported these anomalies to the Vatican's Restoration Oversight Committee. Any restoration project showing such unusual characteristics required immediate review and potential suspension of work. But I couldn't bring myself to stop the cleaning process. The fresco was revealing something important, something that conventional restoration science couldn't explain, but that felt more true than anything I'd experienced in 12 years of conservation work. As I continued cleaning, the Good Shepherd scene began expanding beyond its original boundaries. Additional figures appeared in areas that had seemed empty when I began. Sheep that hadn't been visible under the grime emerged in perfect detail. Background elements, trees, hills, buildings developed with clarity that suggested they had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. Most remarkably, new human figures joined the shepherd and his flock. Men and women in the simple robes of early Christians, their faces showing the same transformative quality as the shepherd's features. Sometimes I recognized them as historical figure saints I knew from other catacomb art, early Christian martyrs from my art history studies. Other times, the faces belonged to people from my contemporary life. My mother appeared as one of the sheep, her expression peaceful and content. Professor Martinelli stood among the apostolic figures, his teaching demeanor translated into ancient pigment. My brother Carlo knelt in prayer beside a figure that looked unmistakably like our grandfather, who had died when we were children. The fresco was becoming a family portrait painted across time. But the most profound transformation occurred in the third week of restoration. As I cleaned the central area around the shepherd's staff, a new figure emerged, a woman, kneeling at Christ's feet, her hands reaching upward in a gesture of supplication or offering. The woman's face was mine, but older than my current 34 years, wiser perhaps, marked by experiences I hadn't had yet. The painted version of myself was looking directly out of the fresco, making eye contact with me across the centuries that separated her creation from my observation. When I stepped back to examine the overall composition, I realized that the entire fresco had become a complex theological statement about the relationship between time, identity, and salvation. The Good Shepherd wasn't just caring for abstract sheep, he was gathering specific souls across history, including souls that wouldn't exist until long after the fresco was painted. The ancient artist had somehow painted the future. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the catacomb chamber, but not as a restorer. I was the woman in the fresco, kneeling before the shepherd, offering him something I couldn't see, but that felt immeasurably precious. In the dream, the shepherd spoke to me in accented Latin. "Isabella, daughter of artists, keeper of colors, you restore not just the paint, but the prayer. Each stroke of your brush completes the intercession that began when the first pigment touched the plaster." This fresco was painted not just for the believers of the 4th century, but for the believer who would uncover it in the 20 honest. Every face you reveal is a prayer for the person who will see that face and recognize in it their own calling to join the eternal flock. When I woke, I found my hands stained with pigments I hadn't been using, colors that matched the ancient palette of the fresco, as if I had been painting in my sleep. I returned to the catacomb that morning to find the restoration complete. Not just the areas I had been working on, but the entire fresco cleaned, stabilized, and perfectly preserved. The work that should have taken me 3 more months had been finished overnight by hands other than mine. But the fresco was no longer the Good Shepherd scene I had been restoring. The ancient plaster now showed a workshop Sanaean artist painting a fresco while a woman kneels nearby, offering colors from a palette that glows with its own light. The artist's face was unrecognizable, generic, timeless, but the woman offering the pigments looked exactly like me. At the bottom of the fresco, in perfect Latin script that matched the original 4th century calligraphy, a new inscription had appeared. Isabella Romano, restorer of sacred images, who learned that some paintings restore the painter. Her work will continue in colors that do not fade, in pigments that exist before the wall is built. I sealed the chamber that afternoon and submitted a report describing the successful completion of the restoration project. The Vatican accepted my documentation without question. The catacomb was returned to its restricted status. But I've been painting ever since. No contemporary artwork, but ancient frescoes that somehow need to be created in the present to be discovered in the future. I work with pigments that glow in the dark, on walls that exist in catacomb chambers I've never physically visited. Some restoration work doesn't end when the ancient paint is clean. Some restoration work begins when you realize that time flows in both directions, and that the ancient artists have been waiting centuries for exactly the right person to help them finish what they started. I am that person, and the work continues. In colors that don't exist yet, on walls that are still being built, for viewers who won't be born for generations. The art of eternity requires patient hands and faithful hearts. I have both now. My name is Dr. Francesco Alberti, Vatican Archaeological Commission. The San Callisto catacombs extend for nearly 20 kilometers beneath Rome, but Section 7 Delta has been sealed since 1953. The official reason given in our records was structural instability. But after 30 years of archaeological work in these tunnels, I've learned that some Vatican closures have nothing to do with architecture. Last month, I was granted special permission to explore 7 Delta as part of a comprehensive mapping project. The Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology wanted detailed documentation of all burial chambers before the planned restoration work begins in 2025. What I found in those sealed passages has convinced me that some restorations should never be attempted. The entrance to 7 Delta lies 3 levels below the public tourist routes, accessed through a narrow tunnel that requires crawling for nearly 50 meters. The air down there tastes of centuries, not just age, but something deeper. Time itself, maybe, concentrated and stagnant in chambers where nothing has moved for decades. The first anomaly I noticed was the temperature. While the main catacomb levels maintain a constant 12 degrees Celsius, 7 Delta was noticeably warmer, perhaps 18 degrees Celsius, with no apparent heating source. The walls wept condensation that left salt deposits in patterns too regular to be natural, almost like text in a language I couldn't identify. My preliminary survey revealed the expected Christian burial chambers, loculi carved into the tough walls, fragments of 3rd and 4th century frescoes depicting biblical scenes, inscriptions in Latin and Greek marking the final resting places of early Roman Christians. Standard catacomb architecture, nothing that would justify 7 decades of closure. But in the deepest chamber, I found the ossuary. It wasn't marked on any catacomb map I'd studied. A circular room carved from the bedrock, approximately 8 meters in diameter, with bones arranged in precise geometric patterns along the walls. Not the random stacking typical of overcrowded burial sites, but deliberate, almost ritualistic arrangements. The bones were sorted by type femurs in one section, ribs in another, skulls arranged in perfect rows according to size. But most disturbing was their condition. Despite being interred for over 15 centuries, they showed no signs of decay, no mineral deposits, no discoloration, no fragility. They looked as fresh as if they'd been placed there weeks ago. In the center of the ossuary stood a stone altar, also absent from historical records, carved from single piece of black marble, inscribed with symbols that predated Christian iconography. The markings appeared to be some form of early Latin, but the grammar was wrong verb tenses that shouldn't exist, noun declensions that followed no known pattern. I photographed everything, took detailed measurements, collected samples of the unusual inscriptions for analysis, standard archaeological procedure. But as I worked, I became aware of sounds echoing from deeper in the catacomb system, sounds that shouldn't exist in a sealed section. Footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate, chanting in what sounded like Latin, but with pronunciations I'd never heard in liturgical contexts. The scraping of stone against stone, as if heavy objects were being moved. I followed the sounds deeper into 7 Delta, through passages that became increasingly narrow and crude. The careful stonework of the main chambers gave way to rough-hewn tunnels that seemed more like natural caves than human construction. The air grew warmer with each turn, and the condensation on the walls began forming more complex patterns, not just salt deposits now, but actual text. Latin words appearing and disappearing as moisture levels changed. Expectamus adventum eius qui venturus est. We await the coming of He who will come. In profundis terrae veritas habitat. In the depths of the earth, truth dwells. Qui descendit ascendit. Qui ascendit descendit. He who descends shall ascend. He who ascends shall descend. The passages opened into a vast underground chamber that couldn't possibly exist. My geological surveys of the area showed solid tuff for hundreds of meters in every direction. Yet here was a cavern large enough to house St. Peter's Basilica. The ceiling disappeared into darkness beyond the range of my lights. The floor was covered with graves, not burial niches carved into walls, but actual graves dug into the earth, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, extending into the shadows beyond my vision, each marked with a simple wooden cross, weathered but intact, despite the apparent age. And from these graves came the sounds I'd been hearing, not the footsteps of the living, but the movements of those trying to remember how to walk. Not chanting, but the voices of people learning to speak again after centuries of silence. Not stones being moved, but the sound of burial slabs being pushed aside from within. I stood at the edge of that impossible cemetery and watched the dead practice resurrection. They moved slowly, uncertainly, like sleepers waking from dreams too deep for easy recall. Some sat on the edges of their graves, flexing fingers that remembered touch. Others stood and walked in small circles, reacquainting themselves with physical movement. A few gathered in groups, speaking in whispers that carried across the vast space like wind through distant trees. They were dressed in burial clothes from different eras, Roman togas, medieval robes, Renaissance doublets, even modern suits and dresses. Not the clothing of the officially blessed, but the garments of ordinary Christians who had been buried in these depths across 15 centuries. And they were all looking at me. Not with hostility or surprise, but with something worse, recognition. As if they'd been expecting me, waiting for me, preparing for my arrival in their rehearsal for whatever comes after the final judgment. One figure separated from the others and approached a woman in 4th century dress, her burial shroud still pristine white despite centuries in the earth. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying no trace of the grave. Dr. Francesco Alberti, born 23 August 1964, appointed to the Vatican Archaeological Commission, 15 March 1994, specialist in early Christian burial practices. You have been sent to document what cannot be documented, to map what exists beyond mortal geography. She knew things about my life I'd never told anyone. My private struggles with faith, my reasons for choosing archaeology over the priesthood my father wanted for me, even my childhood fear of confined spaces that I'd overcome to work in the catacombs. "Why are you here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "We practice," she said simply. "Death is only the beginning of our service to God. When the final trumpet sounds, we must be ready. We must remember how to stand, how to walk, how to speak the words of judgment and mercy." She gestured toward the other figures, moving through their careful rehearsals. Some have been practicing for centuries. Others are newly arrived. All of us wait for the day when practice becomes performance. And what happens then? Her smile was both beautiful and terrible. Then the boundary between the city of God and the city of man dissolves completely. Then the Vatican above becomes what it has always been, in potential the embassy of eternity on earth. I asked if I could return, if I could study what I'd found, if I could document this impossible rehearsal for resurrection. She nodded graciously. "You may return once more, Francesco, to collect your equipment, to complete your photographs, to finish what you came here to do. But understand the next time you descend to 7 Delta, it will not be as an archaeologist." "Then, as what?" as one who has learned what lies beneath faith, beneath hope, beneath all the comfortable doctrines that help the living sleep peacefully above ground. I left the chamber, crawled back through the narrow passages, climbed to the surface with hands shaking so badly I could barely operate my equipment. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, couldn't dismiss it as hallucination or breakdown. Because I'd taken photographs. Clear, detailed, undeniable documentation of the impossible cemetery and its patient inhabitants. When I developed the film, every frame was blank. Not overexposed or underexposed, completely blank, as if I'd been photographing empty tunnels and solid walls. But the voice recorder I'd been carrying captured everything. Every word of my conversation with the woman in the burial shroud, every whispered conversation between the practicing dead, every scrape of movement in that vast underground rehearsal hall. I'm scheduled to return to 7 Delta tomorrow to retrieve the rest of my equipment. Official closure of the archaeological survey, final documentation before the section is resealed. But I know I won't be coming back. Some archaeological discoveries aren't meant to be shared with the world above. Some truths about what lies beneath Vatican City must remain buried until the day when burial itself becomes meaningless. I've submitted my final report recommending permanent closure of 7 Delta. Structural instability, I wrote. The same reason given in 1953. Some lies become true through repetition. Some seals should never be broken. And some archaeologists learn that the most important excavations happen not in the earth, but in the soul. Tonight I pray for forgiveness for what I've seen, and for strength to keep secret what I've learned. But mostly I pray that when my time comes, I'll be ready for whatever rehearsals await in the darkness beneath sacred ground. My name is Marco Vincenti, Catacomb Tour Guide. I've been leading tours through the San Sebastiano catacombs for 12 years. 3 groups a day, 5 days a week, showing visitors the wonders of early Christian burial practices while keeping them safely within the approved routes. The Vatican has strict protocols about where tourists can go in the catacombs for good reason, as I learned last month. The approved tour covers perhaps 2% of the actual catacomb system. The rest is sealed, officially for preservation purposes, though I've always suspected there were other considerations. You don't work in these tunnels for over a decade without developing an intuition about which sealed passages contain historical artifacts and which contain things that shouldn't be disturbed. Everything changed when Professor Catherine Morrison arrived from Oxford. She was part of a scholarly delegation studying early Christian art, specifically the evolution of resurrection imagery in catacomb frescoes. Distinguished academic, published author, the kind of visitor the Vatican treats with special consideration. When she requested access to sealed sections for her research, the appropriate permissions were granted. I was assigned as her guide for what was supposed to be a routine academic tour of restricted areas. Professor Morrison was particularly interested in Level 4 of the San Sebastiano complex sections that had been closed since renovations in 1981. According to the historical records, Level 4 contained some of the oldest Christian burial chambers in Rome, dating to the early 3rd century, with frescoes depicting resurrection themes rarely seen in publicly accessible areas. The descent to Level 4 requires navigating through 3 checkpoints, each secured with different keys I'd never been trusted with before. The air becomes noticeably thicker as you go deeper, heavy with the weight of centuries and something Elsian expectancy, as if the tunnels themselves were waiting for something. The first chambers we explored contained the expected treasures: frescoes of Jonah emerging from the whale, Daniel in the lion's den, Lazarus rising from his tomb. Early Christian artists used these Old Testament prefigurations to depict the promise of resurrection, offering comfort to believers who knew they might face martyrdom. Professor Morrison documented everything with professional thoroughness, photographing inscriptions, taking measurements, noting stylistic details that would support her research. Standard academic procedure in extraordinary circumstances. But in the 7th chamber, we found something that wasn't in any historical record. A fresco covering an entire wall, depicting what appeared to be the resurrection of the dead, but not the final judgment, as traditionally portrayed. Instead, it showed figures emerging from graves and stages, some fully risen, others still partially buried, all arranged in careful progression from death to renewed life. The artistic technique was unlike anything in known catacomb art. The pigments seemed to shift in our flashlight beams, creating an illusion of movement, as if the painted figures were actually climbing from their painted graves. The faces of the resurrected were rendered with extraordinary detail, individual, recognizable features, rather than the generic expressions typical of early Christian art. Most disturbing was the way the fresco seemed to extend beyond the wall itself. When we moved our lights across the surface, the painted resurrection scene appeared to continue into shadows that shouldn't exist, painted figures disappearing into dark spaces that suggested the wall was transparent, or perhaps that the fresco was showing us something happening in chambers beyond our sight. Professor Morrison became fixated on documenting every detail. She spent hours photographing the fresco from different angles, measuring the dimensions, comparing the artistic techniques to known examples from the period. But as she worked, I noticed changes in the painting that couldn't be explained by shifting light or viewing angles. The figures were moving. Not dramatically, not obviously, but subtly. A painted hand that had been resting on a grave marker was now raised in blessing. A figure that had been standing was now kneeling. Eyes that had been closed were now open, looking directly at us. When I pointed this out to Professor Morrison, she dismissed it as optical illusion, fatigue, the natural tendency to see movement in artistic representations of action. But she also began photographing the same sections repeatedly, creating what she called temporal documentation to track any apparent changes. By the end of our first day in Level 4, we had documented 17 distinct changes in the fresco's composition. That night, Professor Morrison developed her photographs in the makeshift darkroom we'd established in the catacomb's administrative offices. When she emerged 3 hours later, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "The photographs show different images," she said quietly. "Not just the changes we observed, but complete variations. In some shots, the resurrection scene includes figures that weren't there when I took the picture. In others, entire sections of the fresco appear completely different." She spread the photographs across the table. Same wall, same lighting conditions, same camera settings, but each image showed a unique version of the resurrection scene. In one, the graves were all closed, the buried still waiting. In another, all the figures had risen and were walking towards some destination beyond the edge of the fresco. In a third, the painted dead were looking directly out from the wall, as if aware of being photographed. "It's impossible," Professor Morrison said, but she was already planning to return the next day with video equipment. The second day's documentation proved even more unsettling. The video recordings showed the fresco changing in real time, not gradually, but in sudden jumps between frames, as if someone was editing the wall itself while we filmed. Figures would appear and disappear, shift positions, change expressions, all in the space between one video frame and the next. But most disturbing was what happened when Professor Morrison tried to film herself standing in front of the fresco. In the playback, she appeared normal in most shots. But in several sequences, her reflection in the painted resurrection scene showed her as one of the emerging dead dressed in burial clothes, eyes closed, hands folded in the traditional pose of the deceased. "I think the fresco isn't just depicting the resurrection," she said. "I think it's predicting specific resurrections, including ours." On the third day, we made the discovery that changed everything. While examining the area around the fresco more carefully, Professor Morrison found a small opening behind what appeared to be painted rock. When we cleared away loose debris, we discovered a narrow passage leading to another chamber that didn't appear on any catacomb map. The chamber beyond was filled with graves, but not ancient ones. The burial markers bore dates from the 20th and 21st centuries, names in modern Italian, even some inscriptions in English and other contemporary languages. Yet the graves themselves appeared to be centuries old, carved in the same style as the earliest Christian burials. And every grave was empty. Not disturbed, not robbed, but opened from within, with the stone slabs pushed aside as if their occupants had simply left. Professor Morrison photographed everything, documented the impossible chronology, measured the dimensions of graves that shouldn't exist. But as we worked, we began hearing sounds from elsewhere in the catacomb system. Footsteps echoing through tunnels that should be empty. Voices speaking in languages we couldn't identify. The sound of stone being carved, as if new graves were being prepared. When we emerged from the hidden chamber, we found that the main fresco had changed again. But this time, the change was personal and specific. Among the figures rising from their painted graves were two new additions: a middle-aged woman in academic dress with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and a younger man in a tour guide's uniform. Professor Catherine Morrison and Marco Vincenti, depicted in perfect detail, emerging from graves that bore our names and yesterday's date. We left Level 4 immediately and sealed the access points. Professor Morrison submitted her research findings to the Vatican with a recommendation that the area remain permanently closed. Her official report cited anomalous preservation conditions that require further study before public access can be considered. But she told me the truth before returning to Oxford. The fresco isn't art, she said. It's documentation. Someone has been recording resurrections in that chamber for nearly 2,000 years, documenting who rises, when, and in what manner. And the empty graves? Practice? She said simply. Rehearsal for the real event. Some people are called to die and rise again multiple times, preparing for the final resurrection when all the graves open permanently. I've requested transfer to the surface tours the Vatican museums, St. Peter's Basilica, anywhere that doesn't require descending into the dark. My request was approved immediately, without question or explanation required. But I can't stop thinking about that fresco, about the empty graves bearing contemporary dates, about the sounds echoing through sealed passages. And I can't forget the way Professor Morrison looked in those final photographs, already somehow translucent, already half gone, as if her brief time in Level 4 had begun a process that wouldn't be complete until she took her place in one of those impossible graves. She sends postcards from Oxford occasionally, normal academic correspondence, updates on her research, invitations to scholarly conferences. But the postmarks are wrong. They bear dates from months in the future, as if she's writing from a time I haven't reached yet. Last week, I received a postcard with no image, just a note in her handwriting. Marco, the resurrection frescoes are more accurate than we thought. My grave is ready when you are. The view from Level 4 is magnificent. Catherine. The postmark shows a date, 6 months from now. I've destroyed the postcard, but I can't destroy the knowledge it represents. Some tours lead to destinations the guide never planned to visit. Some educational experiences continue long after the official program ends. Tonight I pray for the courage to never descend to Level 4 again. But I suspect that some appointments, once made in painted prophecy, cannot be cancelled by prayer alone. My name is Alessandro Ricci, Vatican Conservation Specialist. The catacombs of Priscilla required emergency conservation work after water damage from a burst pipe in the building above flooded 3 chambers with early Christian frescoes. I was assigned to assess the damage and develop a restoration plan routine work that I'd done dozens of times in various catacomb sites around Rome. What made this project different was the location of the damage. Chamber 47C, a burial room that had been sealed since 1962 due to what the records called atmospheric contamination. When I asked what kind of contamination, the Vatican Conservation Department couldn't provide specifics, only that the chamber required special handling procedures and enhanced documentation. I should have asked more questions. Chamber 47C lies in the deepest accessible level of the Priscilla complex, reached by descending through increasingly narrow passages that wind through the tough bedrock like a maze. The air down there is different, not just stale, but somehow thicker, as if saturated with something more substantial than moisture. The water damage was extensive. 3 walls of 4th century frescoes depicting scenes from the life of Christ had been soaked for weeks before the leak was discovered. The pigments were bleeding, the plaster was softening, and salt efflorescence was destroying painted surfaces that had survived 15 centuries of burial. Standard conservation protocol: photograph everything before beginning work, document the exact condition of each damaged section, then begin the careful process of stabilizing the pigments and treating the substrate damage. But when I began photographing the frescoes, I discovered that the water damage had revealed something extraordinary. The visible paintings Christ's baptism, the multiplication of loaves and fishes, the resurrection of Lazarus were painted over an earlier layer of frescoes. Where the water had loosened the upper layer of plaster, I could see traces of underlying images that appeared far older than the 4th century work. This wasn't uncommon. Early Christians often painted over existing decorations, adapting pagan burial chambers for Christian use. But as I carefully removed loose plaster to assess the damage, I realized that the underlying frescoes weren't pagan at all. They were Christian, but depicted scenes I'd never seen in any catacomb art. The earlier paintings showed the resurrection of the dead, but not as a future promise or theological concept. These frescoes depicted resurrection as a contemporary event, something happening in real time. Figures emerging from graves weren't symbolic representations, they were portraits of specific individuals, painted with the kind of detailed realism that suggested the artist had been working from life. Or working from death, more accurately. As I exposed more of the underlying layer, I found inscriptions that provided dates and names for the resurrected figures, not the Latin epithets typical of catacomb burials, but detailed records. Marcus Aurelius Septimus died 15 March 347. Rose 18 March 347, witnessed by 12. Julia Caecilia Metella died 2 August 351. Rose 9 August 351. Spoke of places beyond the veil. Gaius Valerius Maximus died 19 November 354. Rose 25 November 354. Bore wounds that would not heal. The paintings showed these individuals not in the idealized form typical of religious art, but with careful attention to the physical details of their resurrection. Burial clothes hanging in tatters, earth still clinging to their skin, expressions of confusion and wonder as they emerged from graves into a world they'd left behind. But most disturbing were the contemporary additions to the ancient frescoes. Mixed among the 4th century resurrection scenes were figures painted in obviously modern techniques, wearing contemporary clothing, bearing 20th and 21st century names and dates. Someone had been continuing the artistic documentation for 17 centuries, adding new resurrections to the ancient record. I found my own grandfather among them. Giuseppe Ricci died 12 June 1987. Rose 15 June 1987. Returned to family home for 7 days before final departure. The painting showed him exactly as I remembered from his funeral, wearing his best blue suit, hands folded, eyes closed. But in the fresco, his eyes were opening, and his expression was one of recognition, as if he were looking directly at someone standing where I now stood. I'd been with my family at grandfather's burial. I'd seen his casket lowered into the ground, watched as the grave was filled with earth. But I also remembered the strange phone calls we'd received that week, calls where no one spoke, but breathing could be heard, and in the background, what sounded like my grandfather's voice calling our names. My grandmother had insisted she'd seen him in the garden, tending the tomatoes he'd planted just before his death. We'd dismissed it as grief-induced hallucination, the mind's refusal to accept loss. But the frescoes suggested we'd been wrong. As I worked to stabilize the water-damaged plaster, I uncovered more names I recognized. Relatives, family, friends, neighbors from my childhood, all dated as having died and risen within days of their documented deaths, all painted with the same careful attention to physical detail. And at the bottom of the wall, in fresh paint that seemed still wet despite the centuries-old technique, I found an entry that made my hands shake. Alessandro Ricci died 3 December 2024. Rose, 10 December 2024, completed the great work. Today is November 28th. I have 5 days. I should have left immediately, should have sealed the chamber and recommended against further restoration work. But I couldn't stop uncovering the frescoes, couldn't resist documenting what appeared to be a 17th century record of resurrections in Christian Rome. Because if the paintings were accurate, death wasn't the end I'd always believed it to be. The frescoes showed death as a brief interruption, resurrection as a regular occurrence, the grave as a temporary resting place before continuing whatever work God had assigned to each soul. But they also showed that resurrection came with a price. The risen figures in the paintings bore marks of their return wounds that wouldn't heal, expressions of knowledge too vast for mortal minds to contain, eyes that looked through the world rather than at it. They appeared to exist partially in physical reality and partially in whatever realm they'd visited during their time in the grave. As I studied the most recent additions to the frescoes, I realized that the resurrections weren't random blessings, but assignments. Each risen figure was depicted returning to complete specific tasks, comforting the grieving, revealing hidden truths, preparing others for their own transitions. My grandfather was shown tending not just earthly gardens, but souls that needed cultivation. A woman from my neighborhood was depicted teaching children who appeared to be learning lessons that wouldn't be taught in any earthly school. A priest I remembered from my youth was shown celebrating masses for congregations that included both living and dead, all of them working in the space between life and death, serving as ambassadors from the world beyond the grave. The final section of fresco showed what appeared to be my own resurrection scene, but it wasn't complete. The figure rising from the grave with my face was only partially painted, as if the artist was waiting for the actual event before finishing the portrait. But around the incomplete figure were detailed depictions of my life's work, not just the restoration of ancient art, but the restoration of faith in those who encountered the impossible evidence of resurrection that the frescoes provided. I understood then why I'd been assigned to this project, why the water damage had occurred exactly when it did, why the chamber had been sealed for 60 years until the right person could complete the work. The restoration wasn't just about preserving ancient art. It was about documenting the ongoing relationship between the church above ground and the church beyond the grave. I've spent the last 3 days completing the conservation work, stabilizing the pigments, treating the water damage, ensuring that the resurrection frescoes will survive for future centuries. But I've also been adding my own documentation, detailed photographs, written descriptions, explanations of the techniques used to add contemporary resurrections to ancient art. Tomorrow is December 3rd. I've left instructions for my replacement, a conservation specialist who won't begin work until after December 10th. I've recommended that the chamber remain sealed until then, to allow the atmospheric conditions to stabilize. I've written letters to my family explaining that if they receive strange phone calls after my death, they shouldn't dismiss them as imagination. I've told them to look for me in places where restoration work is needed: old churches, damaged frescoes, art that needs healing. Because I'm beginning to understand that some conservation projects continue after the conservator's death. Some restoration work requires a perspective that can only be gained from beyond the grave. Tonight I pray not for deliverance from death, but for the grace to serve effectively in whatever form that service takes. And tomorrow I will complete the greatest restoration project of my career, the restoration of the connection between life and death, between the church militant and the church triumphant, between the art of this world and the truth of the world to come. The frescoes are waiting to be finished. And some masterpieces can only be completed by those who have seen what lies beyond the final frame. My name is Dr. Maria Benedetti, Vatican Archaeological Commission. The Scavathi excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica hold secrets that would shake the faith of millions if they were ever fully revealed. I've spent 12 years cataloging artifacts from the ancient necropolis, documenting the layers of history that lie beneath the most sacred site in Christendom. But nothing in my education prepared me for what we discovered in Sector G7. The new chamber was found 3 months ago during routine structural surveys. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a void, approximately 30 meters below the known burial levels, in an area that should have been solid bedrock. When we finally broke through the ancient sealed entrance, we found something that shouldn't exist, according to any historical timeline we understand. The chamber was enormous, larger than the Sistine Chapel, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness beyond our strongest lights. The walls were lined with burial niches, but these weren't the simple loculi of typical Roman catacombs. These were elaborate stone sarcophagi, each carved with symbols that predated Christian iconography by centuries, yet somehow incorporated distinctly Christian themes. Most unsettling were the inscriptions. They were written in Latin, but not classical Latin, something older, more archaic, as if the language itself was still evolving when these words were carved. And they weren't simple epitaphs recording names and dates of death. They were prophecies. Here lies Marcus Claudius, who will die in the reign of the fisherman's successor, in the year when fire consumes the eastern provinces. Sacred to the memory of Livia Antonina, whose death in childbirth will herald the coming of the great teacher. Here rests Gaius Septimus, who will witness the crucifixion of the Son of God, and will carry his image in stone to this place of eternal watching. Every inscription described deaths that were still in the future when they were carved, events that wouldn't occur for decades or centuries after the sarcophagi were sealed. Yet the stone showed clear signs of ancient weathering, the kind of erosion that takes millennia to develop. We were looking at graves of people who died before Christ was born, marked with prophecies about his life, death, and the establishment of his church. My team was skeptical, naturally. Dr. Romano suggested we were misreading the inscriptions, that medieval monks had somehow accessed the chamber and recarved the stones. Dr. Castellini theorized that early Christians had discovered the empty tomb chamber and repurposed it for their own burials, adding the prophetic inscriptions as a form of retroactive validation. But carbon dating of the organic materials within the sarcophagi told a different story. The bodies, the burial wrappings, even the wooden funeral goods dated to the 1st century BCE. These people had died decades before Christ's birth, yet their graves contained artifacts that could only have been made after his crucifixion. Small wooden crosses, perfectly formed, showing signs of ancient wear. Pieces of cloth, bearing traces of human blood that genetic analysis couldn't identify blood that was human, but somehow different at the molecular level. And in the central sarcophagus, we found something that stopped our breath entirely. A crown of thorns. Not symbolic, not decorative, actual thorns, woven together with the kind of precise brutality that matched the gospel descriptions exactly. The thorns were from a plant species that didn't grow naturally in the Roman region, but was common in ancient Palestine. The carbon dating was unambiguous. The crown was nearly 20 years old. We had found the crown of thorns, buried in a tomb that predated Christ's crucifixion by 50 years, alongside a prophecy that described exactly how and when it would be used. I stopped sleeping after that discovery. How do you reconcile physical evidence that suggests knowledge of future events with everything we understand about causality, about time, about the nature of reality itself? But the chamber had more revelations waiting. As we expanded our excavation, we discovered that the burial chamber was only the beginning. Behind the central wall lay a corridor that descended even deeper into the bedrock, carved with the same impossible precision as the tomb chamber. The walls here weren't lined with graves, they were covered with frescoes. Frescoes depicting scenes from Christ's life, painted in a style that art historians dated to the 1st century BCE. The Nativity, the Sermon on the Mount, the multiplication of loaves and fishes, the crucifixion, the resurrection, all painted with photographic accuracy, including details that appear nowhere in the Gospels but match perfectly with archaeological evidence from 1st century Palestine. The artist who painted these scenes had either witnessed Christ's ministry personally or had access to information about his life that was somehow transmitted backward through time. But the most disturbing fresco was at the end of the corridor. It depicted our excavation team in perfect detail. Dr. Romano with his distinctive beard, Dr. Romano, Castellini with her characteristic nervous gesture of adjusting her glasses, myself with the small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. The fresco showed us standing in the exact chamber where we now stood, examining the exact artifacts we'd discovered, wearing the exact clothes we'd worn on the day we broke through the sealed entrance. But the fresco was clearly ancient. The paint showed centuries of aging. The mineral deposits that form over millennia were embedded in the pigments. Someone had painted our discovery of this chamber 2,000 years before we were born. At the bottom of the fresco, in the same archaic Latin as the tomb inscriptions, was a simple message. For Maria, daughter of archaeologists, who will uncover what was hidden and will choose to hide what was uncovered. Her faith will be tested not by absence of proof, but by proof too overwhelming to bear. My parents are both archaeologists. I've never told anyone in the Vatican about their profession. It's not relevant to my work here. The fresco knew anyway. Last week, we made our final discovery in the chamber. Behind the painted wall, we found a small room containing a single wooden table, a chair, and what appeared to be a modern laptop computer. The laptop was running. The screen showed a Word document containing a detailed report of our excavation, written in my style, using my professional vocabulary, documenting discoveries we'd made only days earlier. At the bottom of the document was a timestamp. Created 15 BC, last modified today. The laptop was somehow documenting our discoveries as we made them, but the file creation date was impossible. 1,000 years before personal computers existed. When I tried to examine the laptop more closely, the screen changed to show a simple message. Some knowledge exists outside of time. Some discoveries were made before they were lost, found before they were hidden. The choice is always the same: reveal the impossible and watch faith crumble, or preserve mystery and let truth wait for its proper season. The chamber will seal itself when you leave. The artifacts will return to the earth. The frescoes will fade to unmarked stone. Only memory will remain, and memory can choose what to preserve and what to release. Choose wisely, Maria. Some truths are too large for any single age to contain. That night, I made my decision. I sealed the chamber, filed a report stating that Sector G7 contained only empty burial niches of minimal archaeological significance, transferred the artifacts to storage areas where they'll remain uncatalogued and unexamined for decades, perhaps centuries. My team thinks I've suffered a breakdown, that the stress of the excavation affected my judgment. Dr. Romano has requested my psychological evaluation. Dr. Romano Castellini has been reassigned to other projects. But I've seen what lies beneath St. Peter's Basilica. I've touched artifacts that exist outside the normal flow of time, examined evidence that knowledge and prophecy operate according to laws we don't understand. Some discoveries are too profound for the world to bear. Some truths would shatter the careful balance between faith and reason that allows civilization to function. The chamber is sealed now, but I dream about it every night. In my dreams, I'm still there, still excavating, still finding impossible artifacts that prove the past and future are more connected than we imagine. And in my dreams, the laptop is still running, still documenting discoveries that won't be made for years, creating reports of events that exist in the spaces between what was and what will be. I wake each morning with the taste of ancient earth in my mouth and the sound of computer keys typing in the darkness. Some excavations never really end. They just continue in places where time doesn't follow the rules we think we understand. My name is Sister Agnes Marcelli, Catacomb Conservator. For 30 years, I've maintained the Christian catacombs of Rome, San Callisto, San Sebastiano, Priscilla, and dozens of smaller burial sites that honeycomb the ground beneath the Eternal City. My work is both sacred and scientific, preserving the remains of early martyrs, maintaining the integrity of ancient frescoes, ensuring that these underground churches continue to bear witness to faith that survived centuries of persecution. The bones speak to anyone who listens carefully. Not in words, of course, but in the story they tell about lives lived in service to Christ, deaths faced with courage, faith preserved through unimaginable suffering. I've learned to read the language of ancient remains, nutritional deficiencies that speak of poverty, healed fractures that testify to lives of hard labor, signs of violence that confirm historical accounts of martyrdom. But 3 months ago, in the deepest levels of San Callisto, I began hearing something I'd never encountered in 3 decades of work. Actual whispers. It started in the crypt of the popes, where the remains of 9 3rd-century pontiffs rest in simple marble sarcophagi. I was performing routine conservation work, checking for moisture damage, monitoring structural integrity, documenting any changes in the condition of the artifacts. The whispers were barely audible at first, like the sound of conversation in a distant room. I assumed it was echo from the tourist areas above, voices carrying through the complex acoustics of the tunnel system. But the whispers were speaking Latin, not modern ecclesiastical Latin, but the colloquial Latin of the early church, rapid, familiar, intimate. The Latin of people who had grown up with the language, who thought and dreamed and prayed in words that flowed naturally from their daily experience. I stopped my work and listened more carefully. The voices were coming from the sarcophagi themselves. The persecution will worsen before Easter. Deacon Marcus has been arrested. Hide the chalices in the house of Priscilla. The soldiers won't search a woman's property. Tell the congregation to gather in the warehouse by the Tiber. The authorities suspect the house church on the Aventine. They were discussing practical matter-shiding religious artifacts, planning secret masses, coordinating support for imprisoned Christians. The conversations had the immediacy of current events, the urgency of people dealing with active persecution. But these popes had died 17 centuries ago. I began documenting what I heard, recording conversations that seemed to be taking place in real time among the dead. The whispers occurred only during my evening conservation work, after the catacombs had closed to tourists. And they always discussed events that matched historical records of early church persecution, arrests, executions, the constant struggle to maintain Christian worship under Roman law. Most unsettling was their awareness of my presence. Sister Agnes listens to us now. She understands the old language. She tends our bones with reverence. She can be trusted with deeper knowledge. Show her the sealed chamber. She will know what to do with what she finds there. The sealed chamber they referenced was legendary among catacomb workers, a burial site that supposedly connected all the Christian catacombs through a series of tunnels that existed only in folklore. No archaeological evidence had ever been found to support its existence. But the whispers began giving me specific directions. 17 steps beyond the Chapel of the Sacraments. Turn left at the fresco of the Good Shepherd. Count 13 niches. Then feel for the hidden lever behind the 4th brick from the corner. I followed their instructions against every protocol of archaeological investigation. No documentation, no team supervision, no official authorization. But the whispers were insistent, and after 30 years of working alone in these tunnels, I'd learned to trust my instincts about what was safe and what was dangerous. The hidden lever was exactly where they said it would be. The passage it opened led to a chamber that shouldn't exist according to any catacomb map. It was small, circular, with 12 burial niches arranged around a central altar carved from living rock. Each niche contained the remains of what appeared to be early church leaders based on the religious artifacts buried with them. But these weren't random burials. They were the 12 apostles. Not the symbolic 12, not representative figures, but the actual apostles. The inscription above each niche gave names that matched gospel accounts exactly: Petrus, Andreas, Jacobus Major, Jacobus Minor, Johannes, Philippus, Bartholomaeus, Thomas, Matthias, Thaddeus, Simon, Matthias. Each burial included artifacts that confirmed the identification: Peter's fishing nets, perfectly preserved; Andrew's carpenter tools; Thomas's collection of precious stones from India; Matthew's writing implements and partially completed gospel manuscript. But the central altar held the most impossible artifact: a wooden cup, simple and worn, stained with what appeared to be ancient wine. The Holy Grail. As I stood before the altar, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. All 12 apostles speaking simultaneously, their voices overlapping in harmonious discussion. She has found us, as was foretold. The time of hiding approaches its end. Show her the true purpose of our burial here. Peter's voice rose above the others. Sister Agnes, you who have tended our bones with such devotion, must understand that death was not the end of our mission, but the beginning of a different kind of service. We were buried here together not for rest, but for waiting for the time when the church would need what we preserved, when faith would require proof that transcends historical documentation. Andrew spoke next. The church will face a great testing in the years ahead. Scandals, loss of faith, questions about the reality of Christ's mission. When that time comes, the physical evidence of our witness will be needed. John's voice was gentler, more mystical, but that time is not yet. The world is not ready for the knowledge that the apostles never truly died, that we continue our ministry from the place between death and resurrection. Thomas, ever practical, you must choose what to reveal and what to conceal. Some truths strengthen faith, others destroy it. Wisdom lies in knowing the difference. The whispers began to fade as dawn approached above ground, but before they stopped entirely, Peter spoke one final instruction. Take the cup, Sister Agnes, not to reveal, but to preserve. Keep it safe until the church's darkest hour, when physical proof of Christ's sacrifice will be the only thing that can restore hope. But remember, faith that requires proof is not faith at all. Use this knowledge wisely. I took the cup. It was warm to the touch, despite the cool temperature of the catacomb, and seemed to pulse with a life of its own. When I returned the next evening, the chamber was gone. The hidden lever no longer responded, and the passage had become solid stone. But I still had the cup, and I still remembered every word the apostles had spoken. I've kept their secret for 3 months now. The cup sits in my private quarters, wrapped in simple cloth, looking like an artifact of no particular significance. But sometimes, late at night, I can hear distant whispers coming from it, conversations between the apostles, discussions about current church affairs, plans for ministries that continue in realms I can't fully comprehend. They're still there, still serving, still guiding the church from the place where the dead watch over the living. And I'm still listening, still learning what it means to be a custodian not just of ancient bones, but of ongoing miracles that require careful tending, patient preservation, and above all, faithful silence about truths too profound for the world to bear. The whispers tell me that my time as their earthly guardian is almost finished. Someone else will be called to this service, someone who will know what to do with the cup when the church's need becomes desperate. Until then, I tend the bones and listen to the dead, who are more alive than most of us ever realized. My name is Giuseppe Toretti, Catacomb security guard. 25 years, I've worked night security for the Vatican's Catacomb system. San Callisto, Priscilla, Sant Agnes underground cities of the dead that stretch for kilometers beneath Rome. My job is simple. Walk the tourist routes, check the monitoring equipment, ensure that nobody has vandalized the ancient frescoes or disturbed the burial sites. The dead are generally good company, quiet, respectful, no complaints about working conditions. In a quarter-century of night shifts, I've never felt afraid among the tombs. The catacombs may be cities of the dead, but they're also churches, places where generations of Christians chose to bury their loved ones close to the martyrs, believing that proximity to holiness would ease their passage to eternal life. But 6 months ago, the dead stopped staying dead. It began with small thing sounds that didn't quite match normal catacomb acoustics. Footsteps in corridors where no tourists were allowed, whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify, the soft sound of cloth rustling as if someone were adjusting burial shrouds. I dismissed it as natural cave sounds. Wind moving through the complex tunnel system, perhaps small animals that had found their way into the underground chambers. Catacombs are living systems. They breathe, they settle, they create their own acoustic environments that can fool even experienced ears. But sounds don't leave footprints in the dust. I first noticed the tracks 3 months ago during my routine inspection of the crypt of St. Cecilia. Bare footprints, clearly human, leading from one of the ancient burial niches to the central chamber, where St. Cecilia's tomb holds place of honor. The prints were perfectly adult-sized, showing the distinctive wear patterns of someone who had walked extensively without shoes. But the burial niche where the tracks originated had been sealed for over 1,000 years. I followed the footprints through the crypt. They led directly to St. Cecilia's tomb, circled it 3 times, then vanished at the spot where tradition says the saint was originally buried before her remains were moved to the church above ground. I reported the incident naturally. Dr. Benedetti, from the Archaeological Commission, suggested that moisture had created unusual patterns in the catacomb dust, that I was seeing random marks as meaningful shapes. The Vatican security supervisor recommended psychological evaluation night work in underground environments can create hallucinations, especially after many years of solitary duty. But the footprints kept appearing. Each night brought new tracks, sometimes one set, sometimes dozens. They always originated from ancient burial niches and always led to sites of particular religious significance. The altar in the chapel of the popes, the fresco of the Good Shepherd in the Greek chapel, the tomb of Pope St. Pontian in the papal crypt. Most disturbing was the pattern. The footprints appeared only on nights when important church events were occurring above ground. Papal audiences, consistories, major liturgical celebrations, as if the dead were somehow aware of significant moments in the life of the contemporary church and were rising to participate. Last month, I decided to stay and watch. I positioned myself in the shadows of the crypt of St. Cecilia during the night of Pope's installation anniversary celebration, major event that had drawn thousands of pilgrims to St. Peter's Square above. If the dead were responding to church occasions, this would be the perfect opportunity to observe them. At midnight, I heard the sound I'd been expecting, the soft scraping of stone against stone, as if ancient burial seals were being moved from within. What I saw challenged everything I thought I understood about death, burial, and the nature of eternal rest. The burial niches began opening, not violently, not with supernatural drama, but quietly, reverently, as if the occupants were simply awakening from sleep. Figures emerged, men and women in burial shrouds that somehow looked fresh and white, despite being centuries old. They weren't zombies or revenants or any of the horror movie versions of The Walking Dead. They looked peaceful, purposeful. They moved with dignity and intention, like parishioners arriving for Sunday Mass. And they were beautiful. Death had not diminished them. If anything, they seemed more alive than most living people I knew. Their faces held expressions of profound joy, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for centuries. They gathered in the central chamber, perhaps 30 of them, representing burials from different eras. Early Christian martyrs in simple tunics, medieval pilgrims in traveling robes, Renaissance nobles in elaborate funeral dress, all united by the same expression of peaceful anticipation. Then they began to pray. Not the Latin liturgy I expected, but something older, more fundamental. They prayed in the languages they'd spoken in life: Greek, Aramaic, various dialects of Latin, early Italian, even languages I couldn't identify. But somehow I understood the essence of their prayers. They were interceding for the living church. Each prayer was specific, personal, immediate. They prayed for the Pope's health, for troubled parishes around the world, for individuals facing crises of faith. They mentioned people by name, Vatican officials I recognized, but also ordinary believers they couldn't possibly know. A seminarian in Chicago questioning his vocation, a widow in Mumbai struggling with loss, a teenager in Sao Paulo contemplating suicide. They knew about all of them. Somehow, the dead were aware of the spiritual needs of every living Catholic, and they were using this night of celebration to offer focused intercession for the entire church. The prayers continued for exactly 1 hour. Then, as quietly as they had emerged, the figures returned to their burial niches. The stone seals closed with soft scraping sounds, and the catacomb returned to its familiar silence. I was left standing alone in a chamber that showed no sign of what I'd witnessed. No footprints, no disturbance of the dust, no indication that 30 saints had just held a prayer meeting in the heart of ancient Rome. But I felt different, changed. The experience had transformed my understanding of what it means to work in the catacombs, what it means to be a guardian of the dead who aren't really dead at all. Since that night, I've witnessed the phenomenon 7 more times, always during major church events, always following the same pattern: emergence, prayer, return to rest, and always leaving me with the profound sense that death is not an ending but a different form of service, that the communion of saints is not metaphor but literal reality. The dead don't stay dead in the catacombs because their work isn't finished. They continue to serve the church they died for, offering prayers from the place where time doesn't move the same way it does for the living. I'm retiring next month. 25 years of night security has taught me that some jobs require more than professional qualifications. They require spiritual preparation for witnessing miracles that can't be documented in incident reports. My replacement is a young man named Antonio, recently graduated from seminary, but unsure about his calling to priesthood. I think he'll find his answer in the catacombs, watching the dead demonstrate what lifelong service to God really means. The saints are waiting for him. They have work to do, prayers to offer, a church to sustain through their intercession from the place where earth meets heaven. And someone needs to watch over them while they watch over us. My name is Father Antonio Benedetti, Catacomb Tour Chaplain. I've guided pilgrims through the Christian catacombs for 15 years, sharing the stories of early martyrs, explaining the symbolism of ancient frescoes, helping modern believers connect with the faith of their ancestors. The underground burial chambers of Rome are textbooks written in stone and bone, teaching lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the price of religious conviction. Most tours follow standard route-established paths that showcase the most significant artistic and historical features while ensuring visitor safety. The catacomb tunnels extend for hundreds of kilometers. Only a small fraction is open to public access. The rest remains sealed, either for archaeological preservation or structural safety. But 3 months ago, I took a group where I'd never been before, and I'm still not entirely sure we ever came back. It was a group of 12 pilgrims from various countries, all fluent in Latin, all with advanced degrees in theology or early church history. They'd requested a specialized tour focusing on the earliest Christian burial practices, particularly those from the persecution period. We began with the standard route through San Callistati, Papal Crypt, the Chapel of St. Cecilia, the famous fish and bread frescoes that predate Constantine's legalization of Christianity. But as we moved deeper into the complex, I noticed passages I'd never seen before. Not unusual in itself, the catacombs are vast, and after 15 years I was still occasionally discovering small chambers or forgotten alcoves. But these weren't minor side passages. They were major corridors, clearly ancient, showing the same construction techniques as the known areas of San Callisto. Dr. Müller, a church historian from Germany, pointed to inscriptions on the walls that he claimed dated to the unnest century older than any known catacomb construction. Dr. Müller, Fernandez from Spain, identified fresco fragments that seemed to depict gospel scenes with details that didn't appear in any canonical or apocryphal texts. The group was excited by these discoveries, and I found myself leading them deeper into passages that seemed to open before us as we walked. Corridors that should have ended in stone walls instead revealed new chambers, new burial galleries, new wonders that belonged in archaeological textbooks but somehow had never been documented. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch showed we'd been underground for only 30 minutes. The pilgrims photographed everything: inscriptions, frescoes, burial arrangements that seemed to tell a more complete story of early Christian death customs than anything in the established archaeological record. Then we reached the chamber that changed everything. It was enormous, larger than any known catacomb space, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our flashlight beams. The walls were lined not with simple burial niches, but with elaborate sarcophagi that seemed to represent every era of Christian history. But the most extraordinary feature was the central area, a circular arrangement of stone chairs surrounding a simple altar, all carved from living rock, with obvious signs of great age. Dr. Peterson, a liturgical historian from Denmark, immediately recognized the arrangement. "This is a house church," she whispered, "but underground, and far older than any known Christian worship space." The altar bore Latin inscriptions that made the entire group fall silent. "Here the 12 gathered in the year of the great fire. Here they broke bread until he comes again. Here they rest until the final calling." Below the main inscription, in smaller text, "Completed in the consulship of Nero, in the year of Peter's martyrdom, by those who witnessed the resurrection and will witness the return." We were standing in on a century church built by the apostles themselves. But the archaeological impossibilities were just beginning. As we explored the chamber, we discovered that each sarcophagus contained not just human remains, but personal artifacts that defied everything we knew about early Christian history. Manuscripts written in Aramaic that appeared to be direct transcriptions of Christ's teachings, not filtered through gospel authors, but recorded by eyewitnesses. Wooden fragments that carbon testing would later date to unass-century Palestine pieces of what could only have been the cross itself. Most incredible was the central sarcophagus, which bore the simple inscription, Petrus Apostolos. Inside, we found not just the remains of what was clearly a fisherman from unass-century Galilee, but a collection of items that told the complete story of the early church. The keys Christ had promised, the nets from the miraculous catch, even fragments of the rooster that crowed after Peter's denial. The pilgrims were overcome. Dr. Mueller wept openly as he handled manuscripts that contained sayings of Jesus not found in any gospel. Dr. Fernandez prayed in Spanish over relics that proved the literal truth of every miracle described in the New Testament. But as we prepared to document our discoveries, something extraordinary happened. The chamber began to fill with light not from our flashlights, but from sources we couldn't identify. Soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. And we were no longer alone. 12 figures stood around the altarmen in simple robes, with faces that bore the weathered marks of lives spent in physical labor and spiritual service. They looked exactly as I'd always imagined the apostles would look. Real people, humble people, but carrying an authority that was unmistakably divine. Peter stepped forward, and when he spoke, we all understood him perfectly, though I'm certain he was speaking Aramaic. "You have found what was hidden until the proper time, but the time for revelation has not yet come. The church must first pass through its period of greatest testing, when faith will be challenged not by persecution but by doubt, not by external enemies but by internal corruption. When that testing is complete, when the faithful have proven their devotion without the support of physical evidence, then these treasures will be revealed to strengthen the church for its final mission." John spoke next. "But you who have seen must choose what to remember and what to forget. Some knowledge strengthens faith. Other knowledge replaces faith with certainty. Faith is more precious than certainty." Thomas, ever practical, gestured toward our cameras and recording equipment. "Your devices will show only empty chambers, ancient stones, the same archaeological sites that scholars have documented for centuries. But your hearts will remember what your eyes have seen." Matthew, the former tax collector, smiled with understanding of practical concerns. "Return to your surface world with confidence that the foundations of your faith are more solid than any skeptic imagines. But return also with humility, knowing that ultimate truth is always larger than human comprehension." The light began to fade, and the figures became translucent. Peter spoke a final blessing. "Go in peace, servants of the word. Carry what you have learned in your hearts, not your tongues. Strengthen others through your increased faith, not through your impossible stories. The catacomb will close its secrets when you leave, but the truth you have touched will remain with you always." When the light disappeared entirely, we found ourselves standing in the familiar papal crypt of San Callisto, at the exact spot where our tour had begun 3 hours earlier. Our cameras showed only standard tourist photos. Our notes contained only conventional archaeological observations. But our hearts carried the absolute certainty that we had stood in the presence of the 12, had touched relics of Christ's earthly ministry, had witnessed proof that the church's foundations were laid by hands that had touched the divine. None of us spoke about what we'd experienced as we returned to the surface. We didn't need to. We'd all been changed in the same way, all given the same impossible gift, faith, strengthened not by evidence but by encounter with mystery itself. The pilgrims returned to their various countries. I resumed my normal tour duties. But everything was different now. Every catacomb I guide through contains not just ancient burials, but living presence. Every inscription speaks not just of historical faith, but of ongoing communion between heaven and earth. The catacombs hold more than the dead. They hold the deepest secrets of the living church, preserved until the time when faith needs its strongest foundations. And sometimes, for reasons only God understands, they allow small groups of faithful pilgrims to glimpse those foundations and return to the world with unshakable certainty that every promise of Christ will be fulfilled. We who have seen walk differently in the world above ground. We know what lies beneath, what supports, what endures, when everything else passes away. The tour ended where it began, but the pilgrimage will continue until we meet again in the place where all tours end and all journeys begin. As told by Dr. Marco Benedetti, Vatican Archaeological Commission, in the deepest tunnels beneath St. Peter's where Christian martyrs were buried 2,000 years ago, Dr. Marco Benedetti discovered a chamber that wasn't supposed to exist, and the remains inside weren't finished with their prayers. 26 years I've worked in the scavi, the archaeological excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica. I've mapped Roman burial sites, documented early Christian graves, traced the foundations of Constantine's original church. The necropolis under the Vatican holds 2,000 years of sacred history, layer upon layer of faith literally built upon the bones of believers. But some chambers were sealed for reasons that have nothing to do with historical preservation. Last September, ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomaly in section L7 near the presumed location of St. Peter's original grave. A void approximately 12 feet square, positioned between two documented burial chambers but appearing on no existing maps. The Vatican Archaeological Commission authorized limited excavation remove enough stone to verify the chamber's contents, document anything of historical significance, then seal it again, according to conservation protocols. We broke through the wall on a Tuesday morning. The chamber beyond was larger than the radar had indicated, extending back into darkness that our portable lights couldn't fully penetrate. The air that rushed out carried the distinctive mineral scent of ancient limestone, but underneath it was something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in church altars. The first thing I noticed was the sound, not the dripping you expect in underground chambers, not the settling of old stone. This was rhythmic, almost musicala soft susurrus that sounded disturbingly like whispered prayers. Latin, barely audible, rising and falling in the cadences of liturgical chant. My assistant, Dr. Lucia Ferretti, dismissed it as air movement through limestone formations. Underground acoustics can create all sorts of auditory illusions, she said, but she set up the recording equipment anyway. The chamber contained 17 niches carved into the walls, each holding what appeared to be undisturbed burials. The bodies were in remarkable condition, not mummified exactly, but preserved in ways that defied normal decomposition. They wore simple linen shrouds, typical of early Christian burial, but the fabric looked almost new, white as fresh snow despite centuries underground. More unusual were their positions. Unlike typical Roman or early Christian burials, where the deceased lay flat with hands folded, these bodies were arranged as if in prayer. Hands clasped, heads slightly raised, mouths open as if caught mid-word, as if they died while praying and had never stopped. The whispered chanting grew stronger as we worked. Dr. Ferretti checked our recording equipment repeatedly, convinced it was picking up interference from Vatican radio transmissions or mechanical systems. But the recording showed only silenceur voices, the sound of our tools on stone, nothing else. Yet, we both heard the prayers, growing clearer as the hours passed. By the third day, I could distinguish individual voices. An elderly woman reciting the Ave Maria in Latin, so archaic, it predated any standardized liturgy I knew. A young man repeating what sounded like the Kyrie, but with additional verses I'd never heard. Children's voices joining adult ones in prayers that seemed to blend multiple languages, Latin, Greek, Aramaic, even what might have been early Germanic dialects. "Marco," Dr. Ferretti said on Thursday morning, "we need to discuss what's happening here." She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there when we started. I realized I probably looked the same. Neither of us was sleeping well. "The recordings still show nothing," she continued. "But I'm hearing them too, not just during the day when we're working. I hear them at night in my apartment. The same voices, the same prayers. They follow me home." I'd been experiencing the same thing but hadn't mentioned it. The whispered Latin that had seemed confined to the chamber was now audible whenever I was alone. In my office, in my car, even in my bedroom at 3 a.m. "There's something else," Lucia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yesterday, when you were photographing the North Wall burials, I thought I saw one of them move." The body in niche 7A, middle-aged woman whose hands were clasped in prayer. Lucia swore she'd seen the woman's lips moving, silently forming words that matched the chanted prayers we'd been hearing. "It's just suggestion," I told her, but I'd noticed the same thing. Small movements among the supposedly dead, a finger shifting position, an eyelid fluttering, lips that seemed to shape prayers in rhythm with the voices that surrounded us. On Friday, we made the discovery that changed everything. While documenting the inscriptions carved above each niche, Dr. Ferretti found something impossible. The names and dates were what we expected. Marcus Cornelius, died 67 AD. Priscilla, died 71 AD. Lucius, died 64 AD. Early Christians, probably martyred during Nero's persecutions. But carved beneath the original Latin inscriptions, in obviously more recent lettering, were additional names and dates. Also, Marco Benedetti, died November 15, 2024. Also Lucia Ferretti, died November 15, 2024. Today is November 10th. The inscriptions appeared overnight. They weren't there when we documented the niches on Thursday evening, but when we arrived Friday morning, our names had been carved into the stone with the same precision as the original Roman letterings. "Someone's playing an elaborate prank," Lucia said, but her voice shook. The carving was deep, weathered, aged to match the surrounding stone. It would have taken hours of expert stonework to create such convincing fake antiquity. More disturbing was the position of our names. They weren't carved randomly or as obvious additions. They were integrated into the original inscriptions as if they'd always been there, as if Marco Benedetti and Lucia Ferretti had been buried in this chamber alongside the early Christian martyrs. The whispered prayers grew urgent, insistent. The Latin became clearer, and I realized what we were hearing: not random liturgical chanting, but specific prayers for the dead. Funeral masses being said for souls awaiting burial. Our funeral masses. Saturday brought the final revelation. While cataloging personal effects found with the baptismal crosses, simple rings, scraps of parchment with biblical verses, Dr. Ferretti discovered 2 items that shouldn't have existed. A Vatican Archaeological Commission identification badge with my name and photo, aged and corroded as if it had been underground for centuries. A gold wedding ring identical to the one Lucia wore, but tarnished with age and engraved with a date from 67 AD. The items were found in niches 8 and 9, the only 2 burial spaces that had appeared empty when we first entered the chamber. "Marco," Lucia whispered, "I think we're looking at our own graves." The bodies in the prayer chamber weren't just early Christian martyrs. They were people who had died while working in this space, archaeologists and explorers drawn down into the catacombs over the centuries, called to complete some eternal work that began with the first Christians buried here. The whispered prayers weren't random chanting. They were specific intercessions, petitions for the souls of Marco and Lucia, prayers that had been ongoing for 2,000 years, waiting for us to arrive and take our places in the niches that had been prepared since the chamber was first carved. I'm writing this on November 14th, our last day above ground according to the stone inscriptions. We've sealed the chamber and submitted our final report, but the voices follow us everywhere now. Not just whispered prayers, but clear conversations in that ancient Latin, welcoming us home, telling us our work in the upper world is finished. Lucia stopped coming to the office yesterday. When I called her apartment, she said she was already packing, preparing for the descent. She sounded peaceful, resigned, as if she'd finally understood something that had been troubling her for weeks. I feel the same peace, the pull downward, back to the chamber where 17 niches wait for their intended occupants, where prayers that began 2 millennia ago are waiting for us to add our voices to the eternal choir. Tomorrow is November 15th. I've left copies of this account with my superiors, though I suspect they'll dismiss it as archaeological stress or psychological breakdown. The Vatican has protocols for sealing dangerous excavations, procedures for dealing with discoveries that threaten rather than illuminate. But some chambers aren't meant to be sealed. Some prayers are meant to be answered. The voices are calling me now, not from the chamber below, but from inside my own chest. Ancient Latin filling my lungs, sacred words replacing breath, liturgy becoming heartbeat. I think I've always been buried in that chamber. I think I just spent 43 years pretending I was alive above ground. Time to go home. As told by Isabella Romano, Catacomb Art Conservator. When Isabella Romano was hired to restore 1st-century Christian frescoes in the catacombs of Calixtus, she discovered that the ancient paintings weren't just depicting biblical scenes, they were windows into ongoing events that demanded her participation. The catacombs of Calixtus stretch for miles beneath Rome, containing 500,000 burials spanning 4 centuries of early Christian history. I specialize in fresco conservation, restoring the painted prayers that faithful believers left on tomb walls to comfort the dead and inspire the living. The commission seemed routine: stabilize and clean a series of 1st-century frescoes in the crypt of the popes, damaged by water infiltration from modern Rome's aging infrastructure. Simple conservation work: remove mineral deposits, stabilize pigments, document iconography for Vatican archives. But from the first day, the paintings resisted my efforts. Not physically, the technical work proceeded normally. Cleaning solutions dissolved centuries of grime, revealing colors that glowed with surprising vibrancy. The mineral salts that had obscured details came away easily, exposing brushwork that seemed impossibly fresh for paintings nearly 2,000 years old. The resistance was more subtle. Each morning when I arrived, areas I'd cleaned the previous day appeared dirty again. Not damaged or deteriorated, actively soiled, as if someone had been handling the frescoes during the night. But the new dirt wasn't random accumulation. It formed patterns, shadows, additions to the original paintings that changed their meaning entirely. The first fresco depicted the standard Christian iconography: Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes, feeding the multitude. Classic 1st-century style, simple figures in earth tones, designed to remind mourners that Christ provides for both physical and spiritual hunger. But each morning brought new figures in the crowd. Faces that hadn't been there before, painted in the same ancient style but clearly depicting contemporary people. A woman in modern business attire raising her hands in prayer. A man wearing a Vatican security uniform kneeling among the apostles. Children in 21st century clothing sitting beside Roman toga wearers, all reaching for the miraculous bread. I documented everything, photographing the changes, trying to understand what was happening. The new additions weren't crude forgeries or obvious modern insertions. They matched the original technique perfectly: same pigments, same aging, same brushwork. As if the ancient artist was still working, still adding figures to his composition after 20 centuries. The second fresco showed the resurrection of Lazarus. Jesus calling the dead man from his tomb while mourners watched in amazement. Traditional imagery meant to comfort families grieving for their buried loved ones. But in this painting, the mourners began looking directly at me. Not toward the general area where I worked, but specifically at my face, their painted eyes tracking my movements as I cleaned around the composition. When I stepped to the left, the mourners' gazes followed. When I moved right, they turned with me. Most disturbing was Mary, Lazarus's sister, painted kneeling in the foreground. Her expression shifted throughout my work grief, giving way to recognition becoming urgent petition. By the end of the second week, she was clearly mouthing words, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I'm a trained lip reader, me deaf cousin taught me in childhood." Mary was saying, "Aiuta me," in what appeared to be vulgar Latin pronunciation. "Help me." The third fresco was where everything changed. This painting depicted the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia, patron saint of musicians, shown singing hymns while Roman soldiers prepared her execution. Another common catacomb subject, representing the triumph of faith over death. But when I began cleaning this fresco, Saint Cecilia's hymn became audible. Not imagination, not acoustical tricks from water dripping through limestone. Clear, beautiful singing in Latin, coming directly from the painted figure's mouth. Ancient melodies I'd never heard. Sacred music that seemed to resonate from the stone itself. The singing only occurred when I was actively working on the fresco. When I stopped cleaning, Cecilia stopped singing. When I resumed, her voice returned, always picking up exactly where she'd left off. As the restoration progressed, other figures in the martyrdom scene began joining her song. Roman soldiers sang reluctant harmonies. Fellow Christians added their voices to the chorus. Even the executioner hummed along, his painted face expressing confusion at his own participation. By the fourth week, I was singing with them. I didn't consciously decide to join the ancient choir. The melodies were simply in my head when I arrived each morning. Latin lyrics flowing from my lips as naturally as breathing. I sang while I worked, my voice blending with voices that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. The work consumed me. I began arriving earlier, staying later, spending 12-hour days in the crypts singing with painted saints, while I cleaned away centuries of neglect. My supervisor expressed concern about overtime, but I couldn't stop. The restoration felt urgently important in ways I couldn't explain. The frescoes were becoming more than historical artifacts. They were windows into ongoing spiritual realities, glimpses of events that weren't past but eternally present. The multiplication of loaves continued to feed whoever needed nourishment. Lazarus was still rising from death for anyone who called his name. Cecilia's martyrdom was still happening, still offering the example of faith stronger than death. And all of these eternal moments were waiting for me to clean away the barriers that separated them from the contemporary world. Last week, I discovered why. While documenting my progress for the Vatican archives, I found a reference to previous restoration attempts in the crypt of the popes. 3 other conservators had worked on these frescoes over the past century. Maria Rossi, 1923-1924. Project discontinued after she reported impossible iconographical changes in the paintings. Giovanni Toretti, 1954. 1955. Work abandoned when he began claiming the frescoes were actively communicating with modern viewers. Dr. Sarah Whitman, 1987-1989. Restoration halted after she disappeared during a routine work session. Found 3 days later in the deepest section of the catacombs, alive but claiming she'd been attending Mass with the martyrs. All 3 had documented the same phenomena I was experiencing. Living paintings, interactive saints, sacred music that pulled the listener into participation rather than mere observation. But their reports contained an additional detail that stopped my blood cold. Each conservator had discovered, upon cleaning the final fresco in the series, a painting that depicted their own work, their own face, their own hands cleaning the very frescoes they were restoring. Meta-paintings that showed the restoration process itself as a sacred act, worthy of eternal commemoration. Yesterday, I began cleaning the fourth and final fresco. It shows a woman, in early 21st century work clothes, kneeling before a painted wall, carefully cleaning ancient pigments while saints watch approvingly from their eternal positions. The woman's face is clearly visible, rendered in perfect 21st century technique. It's my face. The fresco has been waiting 2,000 years for me to discover it, to understand that my restoration work isn't just conservation, it's participation in an ongoing liturgy that connects contemporary faith with the faith of martyrs. As I clean away the grime that has hidden this meta-painting, I can see additional details emerging. Behind my painted figure stand the three previous conservators, Maria, Giovanni, and Sarah. All of them are smiling. All of them are singing with St. Cecilia's choir. All of them are continuing their restoration work in the eternal present where these frescoes exist. The painting shows me that when this final cleaning is complete, when the last barrier between past and present is removed, I'll join them in the ongoing work of maintaining the sacred art that connects the living with the communion of saints. I should be terrified, but I'm not. I'm singing. The ancient melodies fill my chest, sacred Latin flows from my lips, and I understand finally that some restorations don't preserve the past, they reveal the eternal. Tomorrow, I'll finish cleaning my own image from the wall, and then my real work will begin. The work that lasts forever, conducted in a place where time itself is just another layer of grime to be carefully cleaned away. Cecilia's voice is calling me now. It's time to join the choir. As told by Father Thomas Kellner, Catacomb Guide, Father Thomas Kellner had led thousands of pilgrims through the catacombs of San Callisto. But when he began encountering tour groups that had been walking these tunnels for centuries, he realized that some spiritual journeys never end, some guides never make it back to the surface. 15 years I've been leading pilgrim groups through the catacombs of San Callisto, sharing the stories of early Christian martyrs with visitors from around the world. The underground cemetery holds sacred history, Pope St. Calixtus, St. Cecilia, dozens of early popes, and thousands of faithful believers who chose death rather than abandoning their faith. These tunnels are a place of pilgrimage, where modern Christians walk in the footsteps of martyrs, pray in chambers carved by hands that knew the apostles personally, touch stone that has absorbed 2 millennia of sacred devotion. But 3 months ago, I began encountering pilgrims who had been walking these tunnels far longer than any normal tour should last. It started during a routine morning group 37 visitors from a parish in Ohio, eager to experience the authentic Christian heritage of Rome. Standard tour, 2 hours underground, visiting the major burial chambers, ending at the crypt of the popes where 9 early pontiffs are entombed. As we descended into the main gallery, I heard voices ahead another tour group, which wasn't unusual. The catacombs can accommodate multiple groups simultaneously if guides coordinate their routes properly. But when we caught up to them, I didn't recognize the guide. He was a middle-aged priest, speaking English with what sounded like a 19th century British accent, leading a group of visitors dressed in clothing that looked authentically Victorian long coats, top hats, elaborate bonnets, not costume enthusiasts or historical reenactors, but people whose dress and manner seemed genuinely period. Father Morrison, he introduced himself when our groups merged briefly at the junction near St. Cecilia's crypt, leading these good souls from Manchester on pilgrimage. Fascinating place, these catacombs. One could spend eternity here and still discover new wonders. His group was respectful, devout, asking theological questions about martyrdom and resurrection, with the deep sincerity of people for whom faith was a matter of life and death. But their accents, their vocabulary, even their physical mannerisms belonged to an earlier century. "How long has your group been visiting the catacombs?" I asked Father Morrison. "Oh, we've been walking these passages for quite some time now," he replied with a smile that seemed infinitely patient. "Since 1847, actually. Wonderful place for reflection, don't you think?" I assumed he was speaking metaphorically, perhaps representing a long tradition of British Catholic pilgrimage to Rome. But when I asked one of his group members about their travel plans, she answered with confusion. Travel plans? Father, we live here now, have done for decades. Lovely community down in the deeper galleries. Very peaceful, very conducive to prayer. My Ohio group was growing restless, so I led them away from Father Morrison's Victorian pilgrims, but the encounter troubled me. Something about their presence felt wrong, not threatening, exactly, but temporally displaced, as if they existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. The next week brought a similar encounter. This time, I met a group of German pilgrims, led by a Jesuit priest who introduced himself as Father Zimmermann. His followers wore simple medieval robes, spoke Latin among themselves, and demonstrated a familiarity with catacomb geography that suggested extensive previous exploration. "We're from the pilgrimage of 1348, Father Zimmermann explained matter-of-factly. Came to Rome to pray for the souls lost in the Great Mortality. Found these catacombs particularly suited to our devotions." He was referring to the Black Death, the 14th century plague that killed 1/3 of Europe's population. "We've been maintaining prayer vigils in the deeper chambers ever since," he continued. "Fascinating work, praying for the dead across centuries. Time moves differently down here, you know. Very conducive to eternal perspective." When I expressed confusion about his timeline, Father Zimmermann looked at me with gentle pity. "Oh, my dear colleague, you're still thinking in surface terms. Linear time, sequential events, beginning and ending. Down here, all pilgrims are contemporary. All prayers are present tense. All devotions are eternal." By the fourth week, I realized the catacombs contained dozens of these temporal pilgrimage groups. French crusaders from the 12th century, still en route to Jerusalem but pausing for prayer among the martyrs. Spanish mystics from the 16th century, seeking contemplative union with early Christian saints. Irish monks from the 8th century, copying biblical texts by candlelight in chambers where scribes had worked for over a millennium. All of them spoke of their pilgrimage in present tense, as if they'd arrived yesterday, and planned to continue their spiritual journey indefinitely. All of them treated the catacombs not as a historical site to visit, but as a living spiritual community where past and present coexisted in eternal prayer. And all of them seemed to recognize something in me that I didn't yet understand. "Father Kellner," said a Byzantine nun, whose group claimed to be from the 9th century, "you've been guiding souls to this sacred place for many years. Have you considered that perhaps you're not leading them to a destination, but gathering them for a different kind of journey?" "What do you mean?" "Some guides don't just show pilgrims the way," she replied. "Some guides become the way. Some gather the faithful for pilgrimages that transcend geography, that move through spiritual dimensions rather than physical space." Last month, I made a discovery that clarified everything. While researching catacomb records in the Vatican archives, I found documentation of previous tour guides who had worked in San Callisto over the past 2 centuries. The files contained reports of guides who had disappeared during routine tours or failed to return from underground expeditions. But buried in the bureaucratic language was a pattern I recognized. Father Morrison, British chaplain, assigned to catacomb tours 1847-1848, last seen leading a pilgrimage group into the deeper galleries. Group never returned to surface. Father Zimmermann, Jesuit scholar, conducted spiritual retreats in catacombs 1348-1349, organized prayer vigils for plague victims. Reports of his continuing presence underground persist for decades. Dozens of similar cases guides who had led surface pilgrims into the catacombs and simply never emerged, but whose presence continued to be reported by subsequent visitors. Spiritual leaders who had discovered that their calling wasn't to bring pilgrims to the catacombs and back, but to gather them for eternal pilgrimage in dimensions beyond physical space. Yesterday, I encountered the final piece of the puzzle. During a tour with a group from Boston, I met Father Patrick Sullivan, an Irish priest, leading what appeared to be a 19th century American Catholic pilgrimage. But when I read his name in my own handwriting on a tour roster from 6 months ago, "Father Sullivan," I called out, "didn't I meet you in these tunnels before?" "Indeed you did, Thomas," he replied with a warm smile. "And you'll meet me again, many times, as you gather more souls for the great pilgrimage." "What great pilgrimage?" "The one you've been preparing for 15 years, lad. Every tour you've led, every story you've told, every moment of devotion you've inspired, it's all been gathering momentum for the pilgrimage that starts when you stop trying to bring people back to the surface." I looked around and realized that my Boston group was listening to this conversation with expressions of calm understanding, as if they'd been expecting this revelation. "We're ready, Father Kellner," said Mrs. O'Brien, an elderly woman from Dorchester. "We've been ready since we decided to join your tour. Some of us have been ready for years, waiting for the right guide to lead us deeper than any surface tour could go." I understood then that my 15 years of catacomb tours hadn't been employment, they'd been recruitment. Every group I'd led, every pilgrim I'd inspired, every moment of spiritual connection I'd facilitated had been preparation for this. Gathering souls who were ready for pilgrimage beyond the physical world, beyond linear time, into the eternal communion of saints that exists in the deepest chambers of these sacred tunnels. Today, I'm leading my final surface tour. Tomorrow, the real pilgrimage begins. The pilgrimage that Father Morrison started in 1847, that Father Zimmerman continued through the plague years, that countless spiritual guides have maintained for centuries in chambers so deep that surface maps don't show them. My Boston group is waiting in the main gallery. Father Sullivan's 19th century pilgrims are joining us. The Byzantine nuns are bringing their prayer books. Even Father Morrison's Victorian faithful are gathering for what they call the descent. We're going deeper than any tour has ever gone, into galleries where time becomes liturgy, where pilgrimage becomes permanent prayer, where guides and pilgrims alike discover that some journeys don't end, they transform into new ways of being. I should be afraid, but I'm not. I'm excited. After 15 years of bringing people to see the saints, I'm finally ready to join them. The bells of St. Peter's are calling us down into the eternal depths. Time to begin the pilgrimage that never ends. As told by Dr. Maria Benedetti, Vatican Archaeological Commission, the Scavith excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica are restricted to a handful of scholars and church officials. I've spent 12 years mapping the ancient necropolis that lies beneath the Vatican, documenting the layers of history that stretch from 1st century Roman tombs to the foundations of Constantine's original basilica. Most tourists never realize they're walking above a city of the dead. 20 feet below the marble floors of St. Peter's lies a complex network of tombs, chapels, and corridors that house the remains of Romans both pagan and Christian. And 40 feet below that lies something else entirely, passages that don't appear on any archaeological survey, chambers that seem to predate even Roman occupation. I found the entrance 3 months ago while examining a collapsed wall in Mausoleum H. What we thought was structural damage from centuries of settling turned out to be a deliberate opening, sealed with stones that bore markings I'd never seen before. Not Latin, not Greek, not any language in my considerable expertise. The symbols were carved deep into the limestone, as if whoever made them wanted to ensure they would outlast civilizations. They formed patterns around the sealed opening spirals within spirals, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed in lamplight, and recurring motifs that resembled eyes, though not quite human eyes. Protocol required me to report the discovery immediately, but something about those symbols made me hesitate. They radiated a kind of warning, a sense that whatever lay beyond the sealed entrance was meant to remain undisturbed. But archaeologists aren't trained to heed ancient warnings, we're trained to uncover ancient secrets. I returned the next night with portable lighting equipment and stone-cutting tools. The symbols seemed to watch me as I worked, their carved surfaces catching my headlamp beam in ways that created the illusion of movement. As I removed each stone from the sealed entrance, the temperature in the mausoleum dropped noticeably. Not the gradual cooling of underground spaces, but sudden, localized cold that made my breath visible in the October warmth. The opening revealed a staircase carved from bedrock, descending at a steep angle into absolute darkness. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, but the walls bore more of the strange symbols, now accompanied by what appeared to be written text in the same unknown script. I should have waited for permission, for backup, for proper archaeological support. Instead, I descended alone into a darkness that felt older than Rome itself. The staircase wound downward for what felt like hundreds of steps, far deeper than any known excavation beneath the Vatican. The air grew thick, almost viscous, carrying scents I couldn't identify, not decay or dampness, but something organic yet alien, like the breath of something vast and sleeping. The symbols on the walls became more elaborate as I descended, evolving from simple geometric patterns to complex narratives carved in stone. By lamplight, they seemed to tell a story, though not one I could comprehend. Figures that might have been human gathered around shapes that might have been altars, offering what might have been sacrifices to entities that definitely weren't human. At the bottom of the staircase, I found a chamber that defied every principle of Roman engineering I'd ever studied. The room was circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my lights. But the architecture was wrong, the curves too perfect, the proportions too precise for ancient construction techniques. The walls were covered entirely in the strange script, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled from floor to ceiling in an endless, hypnotic pattern. At the center of the chamber stood a stone platform, roughly circular, with channels carved into its surface that led to small drains at the edges. An altar, clearly, but designed for purposes I didn't want to imagine. The stone was stained dark in patterns that suggested centuries of use. But most disturbing were the niches carved into the wall, hundreds of them, each containing what appeared to be a human skull. Not arranged respectfully like Christian ossuaries, but positioned to face the central altar, as if the dead were eternal witnesses to whatever ceremonies had been performed here. I began photographing everything, documenting the chamber with the systematic precision that 12 years of Vatican archaeology had taught me. But as I worked, I noticed something impossible. The symbols on the walls were changing. Not dramatically, not obviously, but subtle shifts in the carved patterns that became apparent when I compared photos taken minutes apart. Lines that had curved one direction now curved another. Symbols that had faced the altar now faced me. Text that had spiraled clockwise now spiraled counterclockwise. The chamber was rewriting itself as I watched. I should have left immediately. Every instinct, every year of training, every survival mechanism in my brain screamed that I was in a place humans weren't meant to be. But scientific curiosity is stronger than common sense, and I continued documenting the impossible changes occurring around me. That's when I heard the breathing. Not whine through stone passages. Not the settling of ancient architecture, rhythmic, measured breathing, as if something enormous was sleeping just beyond the range of my lights. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the curved walls in ways that made it impossible to locate its source. As I listened, the breathing began to synchronize with my own heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat began to synchronize with the breathing. The distinction became meaningless as the rhythm grew stronger, more insistent, until I felt my entire body pulsing in time with whatever vast presence shared the chamber with me. The skulls in the niches began to whisper, not in Latin, not in any human language, but in sounds that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primitive parts of my brain that remembered when humans were prey. The whispers overlapped and intertwined, creating harmonies that hurt to hear, melodies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I tried to leave, but the staircase was gone. Where the entrance had been, I found only solid stone wall, covered in symbols that pulsed with faint phosphorescence. I was sealed in the chamber with whatever presence had been breathing in the darkness, whatever force had been changing the symbols, whatever entity the hundreds of skulls had been arranged to witness. That's when I understood the truth about the chamber. It wasn't a tomb or a temple or an archaeological site. It was a mouth. The circular room was a vast throat. The altar was a tongue. The drainage channels were designed to carry offerings down into depths I couldn't imagine. And I had descended willingly into the gullet of something that had been feeding on human sacrifice since before Rome existed. The breathing grew louder, more urgent, as if my presence had awakened whatever lay sleeping in the depths below. The chamber began to contract slightly, the walls moving inward with each exhale, the ceiling lowering with each inhale. I was being swallowed slowly, methodically, by an entity so large that its mouth was a room, its breath was wind, its hunger was patient enough to wait centuries between meals. But the most terrifying realization came when I looked at my hands in the phosphorescent light of the symbols. My skin had begun to change. Not decay or injury, but transformation. My fingers were lengthening, my bones becoming more prominent, my flesh taking on the translucent quality of deep-sea creatures. I was becoming something that could survive in the depths where I was being taken, something that could serve whatever presence ruled the chambers below. The whispers from the skulls grew clearer, and I understood at last what they were saying. "Welcome, sister. The feeding is eternal. The service is forever. The hunger must be satisfied." I'm writing this final report by the light of symbols that pulse like veins, using the last of my equipment before the transformation completes itself. My archaeological training tells me to document everything, to leave a record of discovery. But my human instincts tell me to warn anyone who might find this account. The Vatican sits above more than ancient Christian tombs. Some of the foundations go deeper than Rome, deeper than Christianity, deeper than human civilization. And some archaeological discoveries should remain buried. The breathing has stopped. The chamber has finished contracting. I think I'm about to meet whatever has been waiting in the depths for so long. If my skeleton is ever found in these chambers, arranged with the others in niches facing the altar, know that I went willingly in the end. Because when you've been chosen to feed an entity older than recorded history, resistance becomes meaningless. The hunger is eternal. The service is forever. And now I understand why. As told by Franco Moretti, Vatican Infrastructure Maintenance. 35 years I've been maintaining the hidden systems beneath Vatican City electrical conduits, water pipes, telecommunications, cables, all the modern infrastructure that keeps the Holy See functioning in the 21st century. I know every tunnel, every access point, every maintenance shaft from the Sistine Chapel to the furthest reaches of the Vatican museums. But 3 months ago, I found tunnels that aren't on any schematic I've ever seen. I was replacing corroded water pipes in the sub-basement beneath the Apostolic Palace when I noticed a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the foundation. Different stone, different construction technique, with mortar that looked centuries older than the building above. When I examined it more closely, I found it wasn't solid wall at all. It was a carefully concealed entrance. The opening led to a tunnel system that stretched far beyond the Vatican's official boundaries. These weren't modern maintenance tunnels or ancient Roman sewers. They were something else entirely, perfectly carved passages that maintained consistent temperature and humidity, despite being carved from solid rock, with surfaces so smooth they seemed almost polished. Most unsettling was their perfection. 35 years of maintenance work teaches you that all human construction has flaws, irregularities, evidence of the tools and techniques used in building. These tunnels showed none of that. They curved with mathematical precision, branched at perfect angles, maintained exact dimensions throughout their length. No human hand had carved these passages. The first tunnel I explored led directly beneath St. Peter's Square, then continued under the Tiber River without any evidence of water seepage or structural stress. The walls were lined with symbols I'd never seen, not Christian iconography, not Roman inscriptions, but geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed in my headlamp beam. I should have reported the discovery immediately, but maintenance workers learned to be cautious about disrupting Vatican operations. I decided to map the tunnel system privately first, to understand what I'd found before involving architects and administrators in potential construction delays. That decision changed my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. The tunnel system was vast, far more extensive than Vatican City itself. Passages branched and reconnected in complex patterns that formed an underground network stretching beneath central Rome. Some tunnels led to chambers filled with machinery I couldn't identify, not electrical or mechanical devices, but constructions of stone and metal that seemed to serve purposes beyond human comprehension. Other passages ended at sealed doors made from materials I'd never encountered, not wood or metal or stone, but something that absorbed light and felt warm to the touch, as if it were somehow alive. These doors bore the same flowing symbols as the tunnel walls, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But the most disturbing discovery was that the tunnels were actively maintained. Despite their apparent age, the passages showed no signs of deterioration. No water damage, no structural settling, no accumulation of debris that would be expected in abandoned underground spaces. The floors were clean, the walls free of mold or mineral deposits, the air fresh and circulating through some system I couldn't locate. Someone or something was keeping these tunnels in perfect condition. I began spending my off hours exploring the system, mapping the passages, photographing the symbols, trying to understand the purpose of this hidden infrastructure. The deeper I ventured, the more complex the network became. Tunnels that seemed to lead in one direction would somehow loop back on themselves. Passages that appeared to ascend would emerge at lower elevations than where they'd started. The geometry was wrong in ways that made my engineer's mind rebel against what my eyes were showing me. After 2 weeks of exploration, I made a discovery that shattered my understanding of what these tunnels really were. Following a main passage that seemed to lead toward the center of Rome, I found myself in a vast circular chamber larger than St. Peter's Basilica, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my lights. The walls were covered entirely in the flowing symbols, arranged in concentric circles that created an overwhelming pattern of interlocking designs. But it wasn't the size of the chamber that stopped me cold. It was what occupied the center. A massive structure, clearly artificial, but unlike any architecture I'd ever seen. It rose from the floor in smooth, organic curves that seemed to pulse with faint luminescence. Not a building in any conventional sense, but something that combined elements of machinery, sculpture, and living tissue into a form that my mind couldn't properly categorize. The structure was operating. Not loudly, not obviously, but I could feel vibrations through the stone floor, could hear sounds just below the threshold of conscious hearing, could sense movement in the translucent surfaces that formed its outer walls. Whatever this device was, it was active, functional, serving some purpose that required constant operation. As I circled the structure, trying to understand its function, I noticed that the flowing symbols on the chamber walls were moving. Not changing like the symbols in the upper chamber, but actually flowing like liquid across the stone surface, forming new patterns, creating new configurations, as if the walls themselves were a vast display screen showing information in a language I couldn't read. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the chamber. Figures moved in the shadows beyond my light stall, thin shapes that walked upright, but moved with a fluid grace that seemed more liquid than biological. They tended to the central structure with practiced efficiency, manipulating controls that appeared at their touch, monitoring displays that materialized from apparently solid surfaces. They were aware of my presence, but didn't seem threatened by it. One of them approached me with movements that reminded me of deep-sea creatures, graceful and alien. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my consciousness in perfect Italian. Franco Moretti, Maintenance Specialist, Surface Systems. You have been selected for deeper service. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Not paralysis, my body simply refused to flee, as if some deeper part of my nervous system understood that running was futile, inappropriate, contrary to purposes I hadn't yet comprehended. The figure continued. Your knowledge of infrastructure systems makes you suitable for transition to subsurface maintenance. The tunnels require human oversight. The machinery requires human interpretation. The service is permanent, but rewarding. Images flooded my mind, visions of the tunnel system, extending not just beneath Rome, but beneath every major city on earth, connecting sites of power and worship and governance in a network of passages that had existed since before human civilization. The Vatican was just one node in a vast underground grid that served purposes spanning millennia. "What is this place?" I managed to ask, though I'm not sure I spoke aloud. "Infrastructure," the figure replied. "Support systems for activities that require stability. Your species builds on the surface. Other species build below. Cooperation is necessary. Maintenance is eternal." The central structure pulsed brighter, and I understood with sudden, terrifying clarity what I was looking at. It wasn't a machine or a building, it was a kind of organ, a component in something unimaginably larger. The tunnels weren't just passages, they were veins, arteries, conduits, and a living system that stretched beneath the entire planet. And I was being recruited to help maintain it. "Your choice," the figure said, though I sensed the choice was largely theoretical. "Continue surface maintenance until natural death, with occasional service in the deep tunnels when required. Or accept full transition and join the permanent infrastructure staff." I looked around the chamber at the flowing symbols, the pulsing structure, the graceful figures tending to machinery that transcended human understanding. Part of Methe Engineer's part was fascinated by the sophisticated systems, the perfect integration of form and function, the elegant solutions to problems I'd never imagined. But another part, the human part, screamed that I was being offered a chance to disappear from the surface world forever, to become something other than what I'd been born to be. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. "The decision has already been made," the figure replied. "The question is whether you will embrace the transition or resist it. Resistance causes discomfort." I'm writing this report in my apartment in Trastevere, using the last hour I have before I must return to the tunnels. The choice wasn't really a choice. I can feel the pull of the deep passages, the call of machinery that needs tending, the gravity of service to something vast and ancient and necessary. My surface life is ending. My tools are cleaned and organized. My apartment lease canceled. My few possessions distributed to family members with explanations about taking a position that requires extensive travel. Tomorrow I descend to the deep tunnels permanently. I'll join the maintenance staff that keeps the infrastructure running, that services the machinery, that ensures the continued operation of systems that support more than just Vatican City. If you're reading this, it means someone found my final report. Don't try to locate the tunnels I've described. Don't attempt to map the passages or photograph the machinery. The recruitment process is selective, and those who aren't chosen for service are discouraged from remembering what they've seen. But know that beneath every major city, beneath every center of power, the tunnels extend, and the machinery operates, and the maintenance never ends. Some infrastructure is too important to leave entirely to human hands, but it still requires human oversight, and the service, once begun, is eternal.